They say childhood is a time of innocence, but what if that innocence was never granted? What if you were born into a world where your first breath might be your last, where your cradle stood beside open fire and your lullaby echoed in a home haunted by hunger? This is not fiction. This is childhood as in medieval Europe. We often imagine the Middle Ages as an era of knights and castles, of courtly love and religious devotion. But behind the grandeur, behind the stained glass and steel armour, were children, millions of them, struggling, serving, surviving. Their stories were rarely written, their voices almost always forgotten. Modern history books might skim past them, but the reality, childhood in the Middle Ages was not simply short, it was shaped by terror and tenderness, by faith and famine, by discipline and death. It was brutal, it was beautiful, it was anything but simple. Most people think children in medieval times were treated like miniature adults, burdened with labour, overlooked in death, emotionally ignored. But the truth, as always, is more complex and more human. Because even amid the hardship, there was love. There were lullabies whispered beside hearths. There were toys carved from scraps. There were fathers who dove into rivers to save their children, and mothers who cried in the dark when they didn't come home. In this documentary, we'll peel back the myths and look deep into the forgotten realities of youth from 500 to 1500 CE. We'll begin at birth, where infants were baptized not just in water, but in fear and hope. We'll follow them through fields and workshops, where even 5-year-olds had jobs to do. We'll walk alongside adolescents apprenticed into trades, or married off before their voices even deepened. We'll see the sharp lines of class, how noble children became pages or pawns, while peasant kids herded livestock barefoot at dawn. We'll uncover discipline so harsh it could kill, and affection so quiet it was carved into clay pots and lullabies that outlived their singers. And above all, we'll ask the deeper question: what did it mean to be a child in a time where death was common, but love still tried to bloom? Because these weren't just nameless figures in old manuscripts. They were dreamers, they were helpers, they were human, and their story, often buried beneath wars and kings, deserves to be told. This is the forgotten history of medieval childhood, and once you see it, you'll never look at the Middle Ages the same way again. Love wasn't absent in medieval childhood, it was just buried under the weight of survival. So what does all this tell us? That birth in the Middle Ages was not just biological, it was spiritual, communal, terrifying, and sacred. To survive it, to live beyond the first week or the first winter, was a miracle. To love a child in that world was an act of daily courage. And yet, parents still did. They sang, they swaddled, they sprinkled water and prayed, they mourned, they hoped. Because behind the harshness of medieval life stood something softer, a resilience shaped not by ignorance, but by desperate, faithful love. The cradle stood beside the fire, the salt touched the tongue, and always, always, the breath of the living hung close to the breathless. This was infancy in medieval Europe, perilous, pious, and unforgettable. Now, we begin. We dive into the most fragile stage of medieval life, the beginning, birth, the first breath, the threshold between existence and eternity. But in the Middle Ages, this threshold was more like a cliff, and most children fell. It's easy to forget that in medieval Europe, just being born was a gamble with death. For both the mother and the child, the act of giving life often meant risking, or losing, it. Hospitals didn't exist. Sterilization was a foreign concept. And childbirth? It was more ritual than medicine, more hope than help. A noblewoman named Guibert of Nogent was nearly stillborn in 1053. His mother survived. Barely. But his story is just one among thousands. In some villages, up to half of all babies died before age 5, and many mothers did not return from the birthing bed. But let's pause here, because that statistic, that raw number, hides something deeper. It hides the emotional hurricane that came with every labour pain, every fevered night, every silent crib. The people of medieval Europe weren't ignorant of this. They were terrified by it. And so, Before a child had even opened their eyes to candlelight, a community would rush to baptize them. Why? Because to die unbaptized was to risk damnation. That was the belief. Original sin tainted every infant from the moment of conception, a belief born from the writings of St. Augustine, who once watched a newborn throw a jealous tantrum and declared, "Even the infant whose life is but a day is not pure from sin." Baptism, then, was more than celebration. It was salvation. Priests were summoned at all hours, midwives were trained to perform emergency baptisms, and if water couldn't be found in time, some would sprinkle wine or even spit. Anything to shield the soul. The ritual was sacred and sensory. A pinch of salt on the baby's tongue, symbolizing wisdom. Holy water on the crown, a name whispered in Latin, a godparent's solemn vow, and sometimes a minor exorcism just in case the devil had taken an interest. All of this might sound extreme until you remember what they feared. A dead child buried unbaptized was not just a loss, it was a spiritual catastrophe. But that wasn't the only ritual surrounding medieval infancy. There were older ones, folk ones, whispers passed from grandmother to daughter. In Scandinavia, even Christian fathers would sprinkle water on their newborns before baptism. A nod to older pagan rites, blending old gods with new saints. Cradles were blessed, charms tied to swaddling, evil eyes warded off with garlic or iron. Because even if the church owned your soul, the forest still owned your fear. Swaddling was another act of protection, or so they believed. Babies were bound tightly in bands of cloth, arms pinned to their sides, legs wrapped straight. The idea was safety, to keep limbs from bending wrong, to stop the baby from hurting itself, to mimic the womb. A swaddled baby could be left alone while mother fetched water or father worked the field. Bound tight, one manual said, a babe has no chance of coming to harm. But the truth, that safety sometimes became a shroud. Many infants died in their sleep, suffocated beside parents in crowded beds. Sermons from the pulpit begged mothers, use cradles, not shared straw pallets. But even that had its own dangers. Cradles were often kept near the hearth, the only warm spot in the home, and that meant open flame. One coroner's report from 14th century England tells of a baby burned alive after a pig knocked a coal onto its swaddling. Another, more grotesque, tells of a hungry sow that bit the head off a sleeping 1-month-old left alone in a shop. That is not a metaphor. That is medieval reality. These tragedies weren't rare, but neither were they ignored. Modern myths once claimed medieval parents were cold toward their infants, too used to death to love. But the records speak otherwise. Letters, chronicles, and court reports show grief. Raw, unfiltered, heart-wrenching grief. Parents tearing through woods for a missing child. Fathers drowning while trying to rescue toddlers from rivers. Even kings were not spared. When King Edward III's daughter Joan died of plague at age 14, the monarch, usually a warrior, wrote with agony of her death, calling it the breaking of his heart. And in quieter ways, the love of parents still speaks through time. Archaeologists have found lullabies, literal lullabies, written into medieval manuscripts. One, sung by the Virgin Mary to Jesus, reads, "Lulle, lulle, my little child, sleep and be now still." It's haunting because it's human, because you can picture a peasant mother singing that very tune centuries ago in a candlelit room, her voice cracking over the same words. Now that we've passed through the fragile gateway of birth, it's time to step into the sunlit and often shadowed world of medieval childhood. Because if you survived infancy, your work was just beginning. Most modern children enter school at 5. In medieval Europe, by that age, you were already part of the workforce. There was no waiting room for adulthood, only a ladder. And your first step? Responsibility. From as early as age 5 or 6, childhood in the Middle Ages was not defined by toys or dreams, but by duties, often dictated by the class you were born into, and the strength of your tiny hands. Forget the concept of an idle childhood. It didn't exist. In farmsteads across England, France, and the Germanic lands, small children rose before the sun. They didn't stretch into storybooks, they stepped into chores. A child of 7 might spend their day in a field, not reading, but shouting at birds to protect grain, acting as a human scarecrow. Autumn brought other duties, gathering berries, carrying firewood, tending geese, or fetching water from a distant well, pail by back-breaking pail. These weren't occasional tasks, they were survival necessities. One 14th century Swiss account describes a cowherd boy, only 6 years old, trailing cattle through frosted pasture. He received no wages. His payment? Bread, warmth, life. In towns, children entered trades early. A baker's son might haul sacks of flour or pump the bellows in his father's forge. A tavern keeper's daughter could sweep floors, serve scraps, and learn to mix ale before she could write her own name. This wasn't cruelty. It was culture and necessity. These children were part of an ecosystem where every hand, no matter how small, kept the family afloat. And yet, even in the dust and drudgery, there were signs of childhood peeking through. Archaeologists have uncovered pots with tiny fingerprints baked into the clay, traces left by children helping their potter parents mould wares, not decoration, just presence, just proof that they were there. There are stories etched into coroners' rolls too. Stories like 8-year-old Richard, son of John le Mason. One evening in 1301, Richard left dinner early to go to school, but on the way, like any curious child, he tried to swing off the side of London Bridge. He slipped, and like so many medieval children, he was swallowed by the river. There was no safety net, no barrier between duty and danger. The same hands that carried water might one day carry a coffin. But not all learning came from hardship. Some came from church. Even in rural villages, priests taught basic catechism, the Lord's Prayer, the Ave Maria, the 7 deadly sins. On Sundays, children sat cross-legged in the nave, reciting Latin syllables they didn't fully understand. That was often the extent of their education, especially for peasants. But for children in towns, especially boys of skilled artisans or minor nobility, a different path might open: formal schooling. Inspired by the reforms of Charlemagne, cathedral towns like Paris, Bologna, Oxford and Chartres had grammar schools. A boy of 7 might be sent to sit on a hard bench, chanting Latin verses and copying letters by wax tablet. If he showed talent, he might learn logic, rhetoric, or scripture, becoming a priest, clerk, or scribe. If not, he'd return to trade. And what of the girls? Girls almost never entered formal schools. A lucky noble daughter might be taught to read by a private tutor. Others learned in convents how to sew, read psalms, and manage a household. Christine de Pizan, one of the earliest female authors in France, famously educated her daughter in a Paris convent in the 1300s. But for most, education was hands-on, folding linens, stirring stews, nursing siblings. Still, there was one kind of school every child attended, regardless of gender or class: the school of imitation. Children learned by copying. They mimicked their mother kneading dough, their father sharpening tools. They absorbed language, posture, prayer, all by watching, and in those moments they played. Yes, they played. Despite all the labour and loss, medieval children carved out moments of joy. Archaeologists have found miniature pots and pans, wooden knights, and dolls buried in village homes. Even in peasant cottages, carved horses and crude figurines show that someone, a parent or sibling, made time to give a child a toy. They played tag. They built castles from sand, as Gerald of Wales recalls from his own youth. Boys spun wooden tops. Girls played hopscotch. In the cloisters of Salisbury Cathedral, children scratched 9 men's Morris boards into the stone benches, game lines still visible centuries later. Play was not forbidden. It was simply fit in between everything else. And then came 7, the age of reason. Church doctrine taught that by age 7, a child could discern right from wrong. They were ready for confession, communion, and, critically, accountability. It was the age when childhood, as we understand it, began to end. In noble families, boys were often sent away to serve as pages in another lord's castle. Girls might be fostered to a household as junior handmaids, or to a convent for training. In peasant families, children began full labour. A boy might plough beside his father. A girl might be sent to help another housewife in exchange for food. Fosterage wasn't just aristocratic. In Norse and Celtic societies, even commoners sent children to live with kin, neighbours or allies. It was how you learned, not from your parents, but from your village. Because in the Middle Ages, childhood didn't belong to one home, it belonged to the community. When a child was orphaned, neighbours might take them in. When a child was punished, the town watched. When a child was baptised, the parish celebrated. Every child was everyone's responsibility, and everyone knew the stakes, because everyone had buried one. That's why children, even when punished harshly, were still mourned deeply. That's why lullabies were passed down like scripture. That's why toys were placed in tiny graves alongside broken bread and whispered prayers. Because despite the hardship, or perhaps because of it, childhood in the Middle Ages was not a time of neglect. It was a time of initiation, into work, into faith, into grief, and into a world where every day alive was a gift, and every lesson learned was paid for in skin, sweat, or sorrow. So what were the roles and responsibilities of children in the medieval world? To work, to obey, to imitate, to serve, to endure, and yet, also, to laugh, to build sand castles in the shadow of monasteries, to press fingerprints into clay that would survive centuries, to live briefly but burn brightly in the memory of their people. This was not our childhood, but it was childhood nonetheless, and it mattered. We've seen how medieval childhood was charged with duty, but now we step into something heavier, the sharp turn from child to adult. And it comes faster than most would imagine. In medieval Europe, adolescence wasn't a waiting room, it was a proving ground. By the age of 12, many children weren't just helping around the house anymore. They were being handed contracts, given over to masters, married, confessing sins, making decisions that would shape the rest of their lives. And often, they weren't ready. But that didn't matter, because in the eyes of society, once you reached a certain size or could lift a certain tool, you were ready to carry the weight of adulthood, whether your mind agreed or not. Apprenticeship and the death of childhood. In towns and cities, craft guilds operated like gatekeepers of social mobility. Bakers, blacksmiths, tanners, weavers. Every skilled trade had its own internal system. And at the centre of that system was the apprentice. A boy, sometimes no older than 12, would be bound to a master. That meant living in the master's house, working under his roof, and following his rules. Not for a week or a month, but often for 7 full years. These apprentices weren't paid. They weren't treated like equals. They were expected to obey, absorb and endure. Guild ordinances often allowed strict discipline, physical punishment included. In a 15th century English shoemaker's guild, the rules were clear. If an apprentice was caught out at night or mingling with the wrong crowd, he could be whipped. Not scolded, not suspended, whipped. This wasn't viewed as cruelty, it was seen as moral training. The body, after all, had to be shaped before the spirit could rise. The assumption was always the same. Teenagers were dangerous when idle, and pain was a necessary tool to carve virtue from vice. But it wasn't just the guilds. Inside the home, the same logic applied. Manuals for fathers, especially those influenced by scripture, emphasized that love without correction was spiritual negligence. A father who failed to discipline his son was considered weak, even wicked. One widely quoted passage from Proverbs became the unofficial motto of medieval parenting: spare the rod, spoil the child, and the rod was rarely spared. Legal adulthood and the brutality of expectations. By the age of 14, you could be legally married. For girls, the legal minimum was even younger, 12. That wasn't just theory. Noble daughters were often betrothed before puberty, married by 13 or 14, and expected to take on the full weight of adult responsibility. That meant managing servants, managing estates, and very often bearing children. Take Margaret Beaufort, the mother of King Henry VII. She was impregnated at age 12, gave birth at 13, and almost died in the process. She never had another child, and she was nobility, protected, rich, surrounded by resources. Now imagine the life of a peasant girl in the same position. Married off to ease a family's burden, pregnant before her body was ready, living in a hut with no medical care, no privacy, and no say. For many of these young brides, adolescence was not an awakening. It was an erasure, a transformation from girl to wife without space to grow in between. And if you weren't married, you were still expected to work. Teen girls often became servants in wealthier homes, cleaning, cooking, raising other people's children, for food, shelter, and the vague promise of safety. But safety was not guaranteed. Records from medieval court proceedings show how often these servant girls were abused, pregnant by masters, dismissed without protection, blamed for seduction, left with nothing. There was no scandal, no rescue, just a quiet removal from one household and a fall into the shadows. And the boys, they didn't fare much better. Teen boys in cities often lived under harsh masters. In rural areas, they laboured beside grown men, and in wartime, which was often, they fought. Adolescents at war, you might think of war as a man's domain. But during the 100 Years' War, for example, English archers as young as 16 took up longbows. French peasant boys too young to shave were handed spears and told to defend their villages. There's even the infamous episode of the Children's Crusade in 1212, a deeply disturbing chapter of mass manipulation. Thousands of children and adolescents, led by misplaced religious zeal and promises of divine guidance, set off for the Holy Land. Most were between 12 and 16. They never made it. Some died from starvation, others were sold into slavery. A few may have survived, but if so, history has forgotten them. The Children's Crusade wasn't just a tragedy, it was a symptom. It revealed how easily the passion of youth could be twisted, how little protection the medieval world offered to those on the brink of becoming. And it wasn't just physical vulnerability, emotional displacement and monastic adolescence. Not all teens were married or apprenticed. Some, especially from noble families, were placed in monasteries as novices. This might sound peaceful, but often it was anything but. Imagine being sent away at 13, not to a school but to a stone monastery. You leave behind family, friends, familiar food, language, and warmth. You're told to pray, to obey, and to forget the world you came from. One boy, Orderic Vitalis, was sent to a Norman monastery at age 10. He was English. He didn't speak the language, and he later wrote of those first years with raw honesty. I wept often. My heart longed for home. Another, Guibert of Nogent, was placed in a monastery in his teens. His mother had chosen a religious life and left him behind. In his memoir, he recalls the jealousy he felt when she took in an orphaned infant to nurse. Her tenderness toward that baby only made him feel more abandoned. This wasn't a gentle spiritual retreat. It was a psychological exile. Some coped, others rebelled, many bent under the weight of routine, silence, and punishment. Because even here, in the cloister, punishment remained a constant. The rule of St. Benedict explicitly prescribed whipping or fasting for young monks who disobeyed. Food was withheld, solitude enforced, lashes delivered in the name of spiritual purity. And still, not all of it was cruelty. There were friendships formed, secret laughter shared during candle duty, letters scribbled in margins, a sense of belonging, for some, that no village ever gave, the double bind of medieval adolescence. So what was adolescence in the Middle Ages? It was a trap with two doors, one open to labour, apprenticeship, the expectation to become a man or woman before the soul was ready. The other led to isolation, to obedience, to religious vows made while the voice still cracked and dreams still lingered. You had to choose, or more often, it was chosen for you. No matter which path you took, there was rarely room for self-discovery. What mattered was fitting in, serving, enduring. And yet not all stories end in submission. Some adolescents carved out spaces for themselves. Apprentices formed secret fraternities, bachelor bands, who played ball games on holidays, sang in taverns, and sometimes sparked riots. They created youth cultures within the cracks. Some boys broke their contracts and ran. Some girls defied arranged marriages. And then there was Joan of Arc, 17 years old, who didn't just resist but led an army. Her story may be rare, but it's proof that even in a world built on hierarchy, expectation and control, the fire of adolescence could burn bright enough to light a new path. Medieval adolescence was not an age of rebellion, it was an age of reckoning. You didn't ask who you were told. By your guild, by your master, by your priest, by your father, by your fate. And still, through silence or song, through wounds or wisdom, many found a way to endure it. Not because the system was kind, but because the human spirit rarely stays still, especially when it's young, and still deciding who it might become. To be born noble in medieval Europe was to arrive into the world already carrying a name heavier than your body. Not just a surname, a destiny. Unlike peasant children, whose earliest tasks involved geese or grain, noble children were not just raised, they were sculpted, forged like swords, polished like armour, measured not in moments of play, but in promises made before they could speak. From the moment a noble child took their first breath, a dozen eyes were watching, wet nurses, tutors, priests, advisors, because this child wasn't just a child, they were an heir, or a bargaining chip, or both. Infancy. Privilege wrapped in pressure. Noble infants rarely rested in their mother's arms. Instead, they were passed to wet nurses, often women of robust health and trusted demeanour, who would nurse and rock them as the biological mother observed from afar. Emotionally invested but physically distant. This was standard. It was not considered neglect. It was protocol. A noblewoman who nursed her own baby risked being seen as low-bred or overly sentimental. Her duty wasn't personal, it was political. To produce heirs, not to raise them. King Louis IX of France, later canonised as Saint Louis, was handed to a wet nurse named Johanna just days after birth, and his case was not unusual. Across courts and keeps, from England to Castile, the nobility outsourced the most intimate tasks of parenting. This separation extended beyond infancy, because noble children were not raised to be loved, at least not primarily. They were raised to succeed. Childhood under surveillance. A noble boy might be taught to walk beneath stained glass windows, but every step would be measured. How does he hold his posture? How quickly does he learn Latin? Can he ride by 5? Can he hold a sword by 7? Because his future wasn't just his own. He was expected to manage land, swear oaths, lead men, and defend a legacy. And all of that began in childhood. Training started early. Noble boys learned to fence with wooden swords. They practiced falconry. They listened to tales of lineage and honour, of ancestors who conquered and ruled, a legacy they were expected to match. They memorised courtly manners with precision. Which foot to place forward when bowing, how to sit, how to remain silent when spoken to and speak only when spoken to. But not all pressure was formal. Sometimes it came with a smiling face and a silent threat. Noble girls, groomed for grace and of politics. A noble girl's education was no less intense, just shaped differently. She was taught to sew, to manage maids, to oversee household logistics, and just like her brother, she was watched closely. Not for valour, but for virtue. Could she remain composed under scrutiny? Was her modesty sufficient to secure a powerful match? Could she play the lute, speak French, recite psalms? Every stitch she made, every word she spoke became part of her value in the marriage market. Because noble girls were rarely allowed to grow up for themselves, they were prepared, meticulously, for someone else's household. If she was lucky, she might be educated in a convent, like the daughter of Christine de Pizan. There she could read, reflect, perhaps even write. But that was a luxury. Most were trained not to lead, but to marry well and obey better. And marriage, it didn't wait for adulthood. Betrothal and the chessboard of bloodlines among nobles, children were married before they understood what marriage meant. Betrothals could be arranged in infancy. A 10-year-old girl might be promised to a boy she'd never met. The terms inked in blood, land, and dowry. These weren't love stories, they were treaties. One house gained land, the other gained favour, and the children at the centre, they gained expectations they could barely pronounce. For noble boys, the pressure was to continue the name. For girls, to preserve the name through loyalty, purity, and fertility. The child's body became a political border, its womb, a tool for alliances, its sword arm, a means of defence or conquest. And if the alliance soured, or if peace between two kingdoms hung by a thread, that child might not just be married, they might become a hostage, heirs, and hostages. It sounds shocking, but for noble families, sending a child to be raised in another lord's court wasn't always a sign of trust. Often, it was a guarantee. A boy would be sent to the household of an overlord or potential rival, not only to learn courtly behaviour but to ensure that his father wouldn't rebel. If the family stepped out of line, that child's safety was the price. This practice, common across France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire, blurred the line between fosterage and leverage. Even voluntary placements came with risk. A young boy sent to train as a page in another lord's household entered an unfamiliar world. There, he was at the mercy of new rules, new alliances, and adults who did not always have his interests in mind. Sometimes, it was a chance to rise. Other times, a quiet form of captivity. And through it all, the message to noble children was clear. You do not belong to yourself. You belong to your name. Emotional distance in the gilded cage. It's tempting to assume that noble children lived better lives simply because they had beds, tutors, and servants. But comfort does not cancel pressure, and gold does not guarantee gentleness. In many cases, noble children experience greater emotional distance than peasant children. They were separated from parents by duty, from siblings by arrangement, from affection by expectation, and when they failed, whether in study, in composure, or in duty, punishment was swift. There are accounts of noble pages beaten for minor disobedience, of girls confined to their chambers for not speaking softly enough, of boys shamed publicly for weeping after a fall. Even play was regimented. Games with toy knights, yes, but never wild, never rough, never common. They were watched, always watched, because one day they would be watched by a kingdom. The weight of the inherited future. It's important to remember, not all noble children became rulers. Many were younger siblings, the spares, in heir and a spare. Their job was to support the main line, not overshadow it. Some were destined for the church, groomed to become bishops or abbesses. Others faded into historical silence, their names eclipsed by brothers' titles or husbands' reputations. But for the heir, the eldest son or daughter in dynastic succession, the burden was inescapable. Their mistakes could cost kingdoms. Their behaviour was a mirror of their house, and every word they spoke from the moment they could speak was weighed against the name they wore like armour. Did they want this life? Did anyone ask? Number? They were not born into choices. They were born into roles. Roles with expectations older than they were. Rules written in blood and parchment, not in possibility. So what did it mean to be a noble child in the medieval world? It meant being groomed like a symbol, taught to lead before you could choose, promised before you could love, sacrificed for peace you didn't broker. It meant your life belonged to your lineage. But amid all that pressure were moments of tenderness, letters from fathers abroad, books gifted by mothers, songs learned from a gentle tutor, stories shared under candlelight, even if only whispered between lessons, because even inside the cold rituals of nobility, a child still lived, and sometimes between the silences of duty, that child could be heard. If noble children were trained to rule, peasant children were trained to survive, not with tutors and tapestries, but with calloused hands and watchful eyes. Not in castles, but in cottages of timber and thatch, where the roof leaked, the hearth smoked, and every crumb counted. To be born a peasant in medieval Europe was to enter a world of immediate responsibility. There were no idle years, no leisurely discoveries. Childhood, if it could be called that, was a season of urgency. Because when your family lived hand to mouth, there was no such thing as too young to help. The first tasks. By the time a child could walk steadily, they were expected to carry. By age 5, they might fetch kindling, gather wild herbs, or watch over younger siblings. But by 7, that was the turning point. At 7, you could guard geese. You could shout at crows in the fields. You could carry buckets from the well, your shoulders raw from the yoke. And in the eyes of your village at 7, you were no longer just a child. You were a worker, not for wages, not for pride, but for food and firewood and your family's fragile stability. It was a childhood of endless repetition. Every day a thread pulled from the same spool, a morning in the fields, an afternoon foraging in the woods, an evening helping shell peas or churn butter or patch thatched roofs. No celebration for progress, no gold stars or school holidays, only a nod from a weary parent, only sleep, only the next morning. Risk in the routine. But even these routines carried danger. One coroner's report from 14th century England tells of a toddler, left swaddled near the hearth, whose cradle was toppled by a chicken. A coal rolled onto the cloth. The child didn't survive. Another tells of an infant attacked by a pig while the mother was away working. That child too was lost. These weren't cautionary tales. They were everyday possibilities. The medieval peasant home wasn't childproof. It wasn't even weatherproof. Open flames, open wells, free-roaming animals, rusted tools, harsh winters, hunger. Every task carried risk. Every day, loss loomed. And yet, families kept going, because they had no choice. Learning by living education, for peasant children, didn't come in scrolls or books. It came from shadowing their parents. You learned how to stitch a tunic by watching your mother mend a hem by firelight. You learned how to harness a donkey by trailing behind your father in the field. You learned the seasons by the feel of the soil. You learned prayers from the lips of tired priests who taught between Mass and mealtime. Formal schooling? Rare. Religious instruction? Occasional, if the parish had time. The Pater Noster, the Ave Maria, maybe a lesson on the 7 deadly sins, but the real curriculum was survival, and the classroom was life. Children learned to make do, to patch shoes, trap rabbits, carry grain, dry herbs, grind flour, shear sheep, and spin thread. And when something broke, they fixed it. When something died, they buried it. Even grief was a lesson they absorbed early. Play among the ashes. Still, there was laughter. Even in the leanest villages, children found moments of play. Not toys in the modern sense, but objects of imagination. A carved stick became a horse, a pile of stones, a miniature fortress, a rag-wrapped pebble, a doll. Archaeologists have uncovered clay animals and wooden figurines in humble cottages, small tokens of creativity, shaped by calloused hands or gifted between siblings. Games like tag, tug-of-war, and simple ball play offered moments of lightness, and children, being children, took what little time they had and made it feel wide. They played in the woods, they chased chickens, they laughed around muddy wells and made up songs no one wrote down. This was not a carefree childhood, but it wasn't devoid of joy either. Even among the soot and the chores, they found a way to be children. 7 and beyond, the narrow path to adulthood. By age 7, the path ahead often split. Some children stayed home, helping more each year. Others were sent away, not for education but for service. A boy might go to work for a neighbouring farmer. A girl might be placed with an older housewife in another village, to learn cooking, mending and obedience. These arrangements weren't necessarily cruel. In some cases they provided food and shelter the family couldn't offer. But make no mistake, they weren't choices, they were necessities. At best, these placements were peaceful transitions into adult life. At worst, they became sites of exploitation, endless work, hunger, abuse, loneliness. But they were seen as part of the peasant child's journey, the unspoken rite of passage from useful to indispensable. No room for adolescence. The concept of adolescence didn't exist in any romantic sense. There were no years set aside for self-discovery, no pause between dependence and duty. By 12 or 13, many were considered ready to marry, not because they were emotionally mature, but because their bodies had matured, and that in the eyes of many was all that mattered. Girls became wives, boys became field hands, and those who couldn't carry their weight, they were burdens, or worse, beggars. In this way, childhood was a short rehearsal, and the main act began before the curtain was ever ready to rise. Community, not comfort. What held these children and their families together was not comfort, but community. Neighbours helped raise one another's children. If a parent died, others might step in. If a child went missing, the whole village searched. If a crop failed, they suffered together. And in that suffering, something else grew, a kind of strength, a kind of tenacity that wasn't taught in schools, but was woven into the fibre of peasant life. Peasant children didn't learn resilience from stories. They learned it by surviving frost, by watching lambs die in their arms, by waking before dawn and working after sunset, by burying siblings and continuing on. Not because they were brave, but because bravery wasn't a luxury they could afford. It was simply the only way forward, the unseen backbone of a feudal world. Without peasant children, the medieval economy would have collapsed. They tilled the land that fed the nobility. They made the bread that filled monastic cellars. They wove the cloth that warmed city merchants. And yet, their names weren't written in chronicles. Their games weren't immortalised in murals. Their stories mostly didn't survive. But we know they were there, in tiny fingerprints on pottery shards, in toys buried beside small skeletons, in legal records that mention a child just once, often because they died. These traces whisper the truth, that these children mattered, even if history rarely said so aloud. To grow up as a peasant child in medieval Europe was to inherit a life of limits, limited food, limited safety, limited time. But what wasn't limited, what can still be felt across the centuries, was their quiet endurance. They didn't shape kingdoms, they didn't write books, they didn't leave cathedrals or crowns. But they kept the world turning, one pail of water, one scythe of grain, one tired, muddy step at a time. Not every child in medieval Europe was raised for the sword or the plough. Some were raised for silence, for structure, for God. To step into a monastery or cathedral as a child was to enter a different world, one ruled not by harvest or heraldry, but by the bell. Bells that woke you, bells that called you to prayer, bells that marked every hour of your life from boyhood until death. But few walked into this life by choice. Most were placed there. And once they entered, they rarely left. What is an oblate? The word oblate comes from the Latin oblatus, to offer, and that's exactly what these children were, offerings. Parents, especially those of noble or educated backgrounds, might donate a child to a monastery around age 7 or younger. Some did so for spiritual merit, others for practical reasons. Too many mouths to feed, no inheritance to pass on, a desire to gain favour with the church. To give a child to God was, in some circles, seen as a pious and prestigious act, but for the child, it was often an abrupt severing. They left behind their family, their toys, their familiar sky, and entered a world of stone, scripture and discipline. They wore habits that didn't fit. They prayed in languages they didn't understand. They were taught obedience before understanding, and they were told that this cloister, this cold, was now home. Life as a child in the monastery daily life for a child oblate followed the monastic rule. For most in the West, that meant the rule of St. Benedict, a text that shaped every waking moment. You rose in darkness, you chanted psalms, you scrubbed floors, you memorised Latin. There was no room for rebellion. The goal wasn't just education, it was formation. You weren't being raised to know, you were being raised to submit. Punishment was expected. The rule of Benedict explicitly outlined corrective methods for children. If they were too young to be excommunicated, they were to be whipped or placed on bread and water for their faults. Some monasteries formalised this into strict codes. In 11th century England, Lanfranc's constitutions dictated exactly who could beat child monks, and when. This wasn't casual cruelty. It was part of a system that believed pain could purify, that silence bred holiness, that the soul of a child had to be carved, not coaxed. The emotional toll. Orderic Vitalis, a monk and chronicler, was sent to a Norman monastery at age 10. He was English. He didn't speak the language. He'd left behind a familiar world for one that felt alien, strict, and cold. In his writings he recalls crying often, longing for home, struggling to learn. Another boy, Guibert of Nogent, also entered monastic life in his early teens. His memoirs mention the pain of being separated from his mother, not just physically, but emotionally. She became an anchoress, walling herself off from the world. He was left behind, alone. Guibert describes watching her care for an orphaned infant and feeling not admiration but jealousy. He envied the warmth she offered that child, a warmth he, as her son, never truly received. This wasn't spiritual enlightenment, it was emotional abandonment cloaked in robes and incense. For many oblates, monastery life felt less like salvation, and more like exile. Choir boys, the sacred sound of youth. Not all religious children were oblates. Some became choir boys, particularly in cathedral towns. These were the voices that filled stone halls with sacred sound. Boys, often from modest backgrounds, were chosen for their musical talent or clarity of voice. In return for their service, they received lodging, food, and some education. But their lives weren't easy. They practiced daily, sometimes for hours. They memorized complex Latin hymns. They stood in drafty choir stalls for every service, regardless of fever or fatigue. They were praised for their purity, but often punished for minor slips. There are records of choir boys beaten for speaking out of turn, for arriving late to service, for forgetting a line in a chant. One famous set of dialogues written by Elfric of Ancient around the year 1000 includes boys describing how they would rather be beaten than fail their master. It was said in jest, but only partly, because they knew what failure meant, not bad grades, not detention, but the rod. Even Elfric Barta, his student, wrote Latin lessons that included vocabulary for what a child might hear during a beating. The pain wasn't an accident, it was an expectation. Choir boys were symbols of angelic purity, but beneath the voices that echoed through cloisters were bruises. Why parents chose the church. To us, the decision to send a child away to a monastery may seem cruel, but for medieval families, it was often a rational sacrifice. Nobles might do it to secure a bishopric for a second son. Merchants, to gain a foothold in ecclesiastical politics. Peasants, to offer one less mouth to feed, and one soul safely committed to God. And some believed they were rescuing their child. In a world filled with war, famine, and disease, the monastery offered structure, a stable roof, regular meals, a defined path. It wasn't freedom, but it was predictability, and sometimes that was enough. For children who grew into the rhythm, who found comfort in the chanting, meaning in the repetition, or friendships in shared silence, monastic life could offer peace. Not all were broken by it. Some were made by it. They became scribes, scholars, teachers, saints, but many were simply forgotten. Between sacred and sadness, monastic childhood existed in a space between extremes. On one hand, discipline, structure, sacred duty. On the other, emotional isolation, physical punishment, and a loss of family bonds before they had matured. You were told this was the highest calling. You were told this was an honour. But when you are 8 years old and homesick and sore from kneeling too long, what does honour mean? It means nothing until someone teaches you to believe it does. And belief, in this case, was not born. It was installed. And yet, there was beauty. Among the hardship, there were also moments of strange and solemn beauty. A boy mastering Latin psalms by candlelight. An orphan learning to read the Gospels before his 10th birthday. A young novice, guided by an old monk, scribbling the first lines of his own homily. In some monasteries, older monks took their duties as mentors seriously. They read to children, sang with them, shared stories and warmth. Not every oblate was unloved. Not every choir boy feared his master. Some even found joy in the rhythm, a kind of peace not available outside. For them, the world of cloisters and chimes wasn't a prison. It was a refuge. Final reflections. So what did it mean to be a child in the service of the church? It meant living in a paradox. You were cloaked in holiness but stripped of freedom, surrounded by sacred art but starved for parental touch, called angelic, yet treated as a vessel to mould, to discipline, to direct. The monastery didn't just shape your days, it shaped your soul. And whether it carved sanctity or scars depended on who was holding the chisel. Not all were broken, not all were saved, but each was transformed. and long after the voices of the choir faded and the pages of monastic books turned brittle with time, the echo of these children's lives still lingers, in stone, in song, and in silence. In a medieval village, the loss of a parent was more than heartbreak. It was a structural collapse. For children, the death of a mother or father didn't just mean grief. It meant the beginning of instability, and in the worst cases, erasure. Orphans in medieval Europe were everywhere and nowhere. You'll find them rarely mentioned in charters or chronicles, but they were there. In parish registers, in poorhouses, in the margins of legal documents. Children without parents formed a quiet, moving population. Not because they were rare, but because they were expected. High mortality guaranteed it. Plague, famine, war, childbirth, all left children stranded. It didn't take both parents vanishing. The loss of just one could be enough. If a mother died, an infant might go days without milk. If a father died, the family might lose land, protection, or a source of food. And when both were gone, the child's world became conditional, on the mercy of others. Who took them in depended on class, luck, and location. In rural villages, extended kin networks were the first line of defence. An aunt might take a niece, a grandfather might house a grandson. But that assumed the family was willing and able to stretch their bread thinner. In other cases, neighbours stepped in. Medieval society, especially in tight-knit villages, understood child-rearing as a shared moral duty. There are stories of whole communities organising care for a child after a house fire or plague death. These were acts of compassion, but also survival. A child left untended was a burden. A child cared for could become a helper. Still, many children slipped through those cracks. Some were left to beg. Others were quietly absorbed into unfamiliar households, where they were treated not as family, but as labour. And some were abandoned outright, left at the edges of monasteries, on the steps of churches near market stalls before dawn. These were the foundlings, children not only orphaned by fate, but rejected by design. The unwanted, the inconvenient, the shameful. Sometimes they were infants born out of wedlock. Sometimes the child of a poor widow unable to feed one more mouth. Sometimes a consequence of violence. Their stories were rarely written down, but they were often understood. No one asked questions when a baby appeared wrapped in cloth at a nunnery's door. The church became the unofficial guardian of the foundling. Convents, monasteries and hospitals, especially in urban centres, offered what shelter they could. A citizen might nurse a newborn for a few weeks. A monk might oversee a child's basic care. But the church was overwhelmed and under-resourced. For every child taken in, many more were turned away or given only temporary respite. Some institutions tried to formalise care. In Italy, by the later Middle Ages, foundling wheels allowed women to anonymously deposit babies into a turning cradle, built into convent walls. A bell rang. The wheel turned. The child vanished inside. No faces were seen, no names exchanged. It was a mercy built on silence. But most of Europe didn't have such systems. Instead, care was improvised. A child might be passed from one household to the next, useful as a servant, disposable when sick. A girl could be taken in as a domestic helper, and later pushed into servitude or marriage by age 12. A boy might be brought into a workshop not to learn, but to clean and fetch and sleep in the straw. These were not fairy tale adoptions, these were transactions. And yet, in the middle of those cold exchanges, bonds still formed. A baker's wife might grow attached to the child she fed scraps each night. A peasant farmer might grow to love the orphaned boy who followed him to the fields. Not every foster placement was heartless, but everyone began with loss. Emotionally, these children learned quickly. Don't expect permanence. Don't cry for too long. Don't ask about your parents. Sometimes they remembered their names. Sometimes they were renamed entirely. To be forgotten by others was painful, but to forget oneself, that was the slow erasure. Legal protections for orphans were inconsistent. In some towns, guilds took responsibility for children of deceased members. In others, local councils assigned guardians to oversee a child's inheritance, if any existed. But more often than not, poor orphans had no inheritance, and no guardians willing to protect their rights. And so, Many disappeared from records not because they died, but because they were folded into someone else's survival plan. Those who grew old enough to work were often apprenticed off early, not in the formal contract-bound way of the guilds, but in informal arrangements that blurred the line between labour and exploitation. A 10-year-old orphan might carry coal for a blacksmith, sweep the hearth, tend the shop, and sleep in the cold. No wages, no say. The girls fared no better. Many were taken in under the pretense of charity and ended up overworked, underfed, and vulnerable to abuse. Records from city courts document cases of young servant girls impregnated by their masters or discarded when ill. In some cases, they were cast out pregnant and alone. In others, they were punished for seduction, as if agency existed in the first place. And yet, some managed to climb out. A few orphans gained favour with kind patrons, a nun who taught them to read, a merchant who offered an apprenticeship, a priest who vouched for their placement. These were exceptions, but they mattered, because they reminded others, perhaps even reminded the child, that their worth wasn't lost with their parents. Emotionally, the life of an orphaned child was one of negotiation. You learned how to stay useful, how to read the room, when to speak, when to shrink, and always how to hope without hoping too much. What's striking is not just how many children were orphaned or abandoned, but how often their lives became invisible, because the systems built to remember kings and knights rarely remembered those who cleaned their floors. But the evidence exists, quietly, in legal ledgers, in burial records, in the careful hands of monks who wrote not names, but notes like "a child brought by night," in pottery shards found in makeshift cradles, in songs passed down by girls who never knew their mothers. These are the echoes of the forgotten. Not because they left no mark, but because no one expected them to. And yet, somehow, many endured. Not with certainty, not with stability, but with a kind of quiet defiance that never made it into manuscripts. The world did not make space for them, so they found space where they could. In the kitchen corner, by the back door, in the alcove beside the parish altar, at the hem of a nun's habit, in the dark, watching, waiting, growing. Because even a life unclaimed by blood could still find meaning in service, in survival, in stolen moments of safety. And even when the world refused to say their names, they lived them silently, one day at a time. In medieval Europe, being born was not enough to be accepted. A child could enter the world with breath in their lungs, blood in their veins, and still be marked, not by choice, but by lineage. To be illegitimate was to begin life already outside the circle. A child born out of wedlock, no matter how loved, was not simply a child. They were a question, a stain, a symbol of something gone wrong. The term itself, bastard, carried more than social judgment. It carried legal weight, religious implications, and social consequences that would follow a child for life. Because legitimacy wasn't about biology. It was about marriage. If your parents were not properly wed, your place in society was immediately compromised. The church made its stance clear. Marriage was sacred, binding, and the only rightful vessel for procreation. Children born outside it were not just unfortunate, they were spiritually suspect. Baptism could wash away original sin, but it couldn't erase the circumstances of your conception. And while God might forgive, society rarely did. In the eyes of the law, bastards had no claim to inheritance unless formally legitimized. That meant no right to land, no title, no dowry, no secure path forward. In noble families, this distinction could redraw entire maps. Wars were fought over questions of legitimacy. Kings lost crowns because of it. And yet the children themselves had no say in how they were made, only in how they carried the burden. For the poor, illegitimacy didn't involve royal bloodlines or disputed thrones, but the weight was no lighter. A peasant girl who bore a child outside marriage risked not only shame but survival. She might be cast out of her home, barred from the church, or left begging at the monastery gate. Her child would carry the stigma like a birthmark. Neighbours would whisper. Parish priests might look away. Employers might hesitate. The child would grow up knowing they were different. not for anything they'd done, but because of how their life began. Some of these children were abandoned at birth, left swaddled at the door of a nunnery or the steps of a cathedral. Others were raised quietly by their mothers, or taken in by relatives who offered shelter without recognition. There were no state systems to protect them, no consistent rules about care. Each case depended on local custom, family ties, and the mood of the community. In urban centres, a few were absorbed into the servant class, becoming maids, apprentices, or errand runners, useful if not fully welcomed. In rural villages, they might be tolerated but never quite trusted. People remembered, and memory in a medieval world could outlast mercy. But not all illegitimate children lived at the bottom. Some, especially those born to nobles or clergy, occupied a strange middle ground. A baron's bastard son might be acknowledged, even educated. He could be sent to a monastery, trained in Latin, perhaps even positioned for a clerical role. But he would never inherit his father's estate. He could be loyal, gifted, obedient. It wouldn't matter. Blood without the church's blessing was still a closed door. Daughters faced their own trials. A lord's illegitimate daughter might be married off strategically, used to secure a minor alliance, but she too would lack dowry, standing, and the protections offered to legitimate women. Her worth was always negotiable. Some families sought formal legitimation from the church or the king, a decree that could retroactively clean the slate. But these were rare, they cost money, required influence, and were never guaranteed. Most children simply lived with the label. They learned to navigate society sideways, to make themselves useful, to avoid asking for what they could never be given. And yet, despite all this, illegitimate children were not universally scorned. They were teased, yes, ostracized, often, but not always unloved. Mothers still sang to them, siblings still played with them. A few fathers, unable to acknowledge them publicly, still found ways to provide a roof, a meal, a whispered visit after dusk. The lines between rejection and quiet care were often blurred. A priest might condemn the sin and yet protect the child. A nobleman might deny paternity in court and still leave coin in the child's hand when no one was looking. These contradictions lived everywhere, in markets, in homes, in churches. The community might gossip about a bastard's origins and still offer bread when hunger struck. People judged. But they also understood that not every story came with clean beginnings. Some of these children grew hard, others grew clever. Many learned to move between social roles, invisible enough to avoid scrutiny, present enough to be useful. They became scribes, clerks, singers, guards. Not always respected, but often relied upon. And sometimes, rarely, one rose. A bastard boy might become a knight, not by birthright, but by valour. A bastard girl might marry into a family too desperate to care. In these cases, legitimacy became a footnote, not a boundary. But these were exceptions. The kind of stories people repeated because they were so unlikely. What was more common were lives lived quietly along the edges. Children who grew up watching from the outside, who learned not to expect their name to be spoken in gatherings, who knew that their father's eyes would never meet theirs in public, and still they endured. Because even a child branded from birth can find moments of warmth, a neighbour who shares a bowl of stew, a priest who teaches them to read, a fellow outcast who becomes a friend. These fragments of kindness stitch themselves into the lives of the illegitimate, not enough to rewrite the story, but enough to soften it. In the records, these children rarely appear by name. They're listed as baseborn or natural, or not at all. But they were there, in the shadows of cathedrals, the kitchens of castles, the fields beyond the manor. They carried buckets, lit candles, mended cloaks. They whispered their questions to the stars, knowing few answers would come, and yet they still played, still laughed, still dreamed. Not because the world made space for them, but because children, even when burdened by shame they did not choose, still find ways to imagine something better. Illegitimacy was not a sin of the child, but it was a sentence, a slow-burning verdict passed down by a society obsessed with order, marriage, and bloodlines. And in that world, to be born on the margins was to begin your life in negotiation, not for love, but for place. You learned to bend, to yield, to nod and step back when the rightful heirs passed by. But even then you still stood, still lived, still mattered, even if no one was permitted to say so. To be born a boy in medieval Europe was not to be free, it was to be claimed. The moment a male infant opened his eyes, the world around him began its work, shaping, instructing, demanding. He was not simply a child, he was a future, a tool, a name-bearer, a worker, a vessel for expectations too old to question. Before he could speak, the people around him were already deciding who he must become. If he was born to a noble family, he would one day be a knight, or a page, or a squire. If he was born to peasants, he would one day hold a plough, or a hammer, or a shepherd's staff. But no matter where he was born, there was no pause for discovery. Boyhood was not for wondering who you might be. It was for learning how to be what was already expected. In the early years, boys shared much with their sisters. Swaddling, cradles, simple chores. But that window closed fast. By the age of 7, the so-called age of reason, the divide began. 7 was more than a number. It was a signal. It marked a shift from softness to shaping. Boys were now held to new standards. They were expected to know right from wrong, to learn obedience, to show strength. Their days stretched longer. Their tasks grew harder. Their mistakes less forgivable. For peasant boys, life moved swiftly into labour. One year you were playing with sticks. The next you were scaring birds from the barley field, or driving oxen behind your father, or tending goats on the village edge. You learned by watching, not by asking. You imitated movements, memorised rhythms. No one sat you down to explain what was required. They simply waited for you to act as if you understood. You were told to be tough, not with words, but with silence. You were expected not to cry when you stumbled, not to complain when your hands blistered, not to flinch when scolded. In town households, artisan boys grew up in the shadow of the workshop. A blacksmith's son pumped the bellows, a cooper's boy rolled barrels, a miller's child cleaned the wheels and hauled sacks twice his size. It was not seen as exploitation, it was preparation. Work was the measure of worth, and a boy who did not work was a boy who failed to be useful. In noble households, the path looked different, but carried the same weight. A boy born to the upper ranks was not handed toys. He was handed responsibilities. By 7, he might be sent away, not because of neglect, but because of tradition. Noble boys often left home to serve as pages in the castle of a father's ally. There, they began the long training toward knighthood. Swordplay with wooden blades, riding lessons, lessons in etiquette, in Latin, in heraldry. These weren't options. They were obligations. He was expected to be brave, to remain upright when struck in mock duels, to serve without complaint, to show dignity in silence. No one cared how homesick he felt. No one asked if he was afraid. The performance of masculinity was constant, at home, at court, at church. Even in monasteries where some boys were sent to become monks or clerics, the expectations didn't vanish. They simply shifted. Strength became endurance, obedience became virtue, and emotion again was best kept hidden. Corporal punishment was common. A boy who failed to recite scripture might be beaten. One who spoke out of turn might be slapped. One who cried during lessons might be mocked. The goal wasn't cruelty, not intentionally. The goal was correction. Pain was seen as a path to discipline, and discipline was a boy's duty. The church reinforced this model. Priests taught that boys must learn restraint. They must control their bodies, control their thoughts, resist temptation, but above all they must obey. Fathers, masters, priests, and eventually God. Masculine virtue wasn't described with softness. It was defined through strength, service, silence, sacrifice. Even humility was a performance. You bowed not out of sincerity, but because you were trained to know your place. There were moments of affection, yes. A father might teach his son how to carve wood. An older brother might slip an apple into your satchel after a hard day. A mother might whisper a prayer before you left for your first posting. But these gestures came quietly, tucked between expectations. No one said, "You're still a boy." They said, "You're ready." whether you were or not. And readiness didn't protect you from danger. Boys, particularly teens, were exposed to every risk adults faced. In towns, apprentices were sent to collect debts, to carry tools through crime-ridden alleys, to work near open flames and sharp edges. In the countryside, they wrangled livestock, chopped trees, built fences. In noble circles, they were sent into combat training, bruised, blooded, pushed, until they no longer flinched. When war came, boys were sometimes conscripted, not always formally. Sometimes they just followed their lords into battle. There are accounts of boys as young as 14 wielding swords in raids. Some fought in crusades. Others died before they ever reached the front. What mattered wasn't their survival. What mattered was that they showed no fear. The burden of masculinity in medieval Europe wasn't simply physical. It was spiritual, emotional, legal. By 14, a boy could be tried for crimes. He could be hanged in England for theft. He could be punished like a man even if his voice hadn't yet changed. And yet, amid all this expectation, there were traces of childhood that persisted. A game scratched into a stone wall, a whistle carved from wood, a scribbled drawing in the margins of a Latin primer, a burst of laughter behind the cathedral, a moment of rebellion, quickly punished but still cherished. These glimpses remind us that the boys of the Middle Ages were not machines. They were human, pulled between the pressure to perform and the instincts of play, between obedience and curiosity. Some adapted, some rebelled, some broke, but all were shaped by a system that saw boyhood not as a time for freedom, but as a trial. A narrow corridor toward a role they didn't choose, enforced by voices that had long forgotten what it meant to be small, to be uncertain, to want to rest. So what did it mean to be a boy in medieval Europe? It meant learning early that your life belonged to others. It meant proving your value before you knew your worth. It meant carrying burdens while pretending they were light. It meant doing what was expected, or being punished for what wasn't. To be born a girl in medieval Europe was to enter a world already arranged around you. Your name might be chosen after a saint or a grandmother, but your path, your duties, your virtues, your future, would not be yours to design. From the earliest days, girls were shaped not simply by what they could do, but by what they were expected to become. The language was soft, but the structure was firm. A girl was to be quiet, obedient, modest, useful. Not because she chose to be, but because that was the mould handed down from mother to daughter, generation after generation. In the first years of life, a girl's world was shared with her brothers. Same cradle, same lullabies, same bowl at the table. But by age 7, the lines began to form. 7, again, was the hinge, the age of reason, the age of transition, where boys were steered toward ploughs and pageships, girls were steered towards service and survival. In peasant homes, that meant learning the skills of the household. Not abstract virtues, but tangible labour. How to knead bread, mend clothes, carry water, tend fire, and care for smaller children. She learned by imitation, by standing beside her mother as she stirred porridge, by holding a crying infant while her aunt beat the laundry against the river stones, by threading a needle into cloth so often her fingers stiffened. There was no ceremony to it, no official curriculum, but every task taught her that her value was measured by her usefulness. There was no such thing as doing too much, only too little. In noble households, the expectations looked more refined, but the core was the same. A young lady might be taught to read, just enough to navigate a psalter or recite a Latin prayer. She learned to sew, to arrange flowers, to play the lute, to sit with still hands and answer questions with soft eyes. These weren't just accomplishments. They were preparations for marriage, the true horizon of a girl's life. Everything pointed toward it. Whether you were born in a manor or a hut, the assumption was fixed. You would marry. You would bear children. You would serve your husband's household. The only question was when, and whether it would help your family rise or at least not fall. For noble girls, betrothals often came early. A child of 10 might already be promised. A girl of 12 might be married, even if the consummation was delayed. These were not decisions made with her consent. They were made to secure alliances, to seal land deals, to settle debts. And when the wedding came, so did the shift. A girl became a woman not with age, but with duty. She left her home and entered another, where new rules, new elders, and new expectations awaited. In rare cases, noble girls were sent to convents, not always for piety, but to receive education and discipline, or to be removed from marriage markets they were not suited for. In these settings, they might read more, write, study scripture, learn herbal medicine or music. But even there, the expectations remained shaped by their sex. They were to be pure, reserved, governed. For peasant girls, marriage came later, usually in the mid to late teens, but the wait was no less. A girl who reached 14 without a husband might already be seen as late. She was expected to be fertile, faithful, and industrious. Her role was clear: bear children, tend the hearth, make the little that the household had stretch as far as it could go. For girls who were not married off, or whose families were too poor to support them, there was another path: service. Many girls became maids in wealthier households. There, they cooked, cleaned, scrubbed, fetched, nursed, obeyed. The work was hard and the risks were real. They were often sent away from home while still children. At 10, 11, 12, they lived among strangers, and in some cases they were exploited, overworked, underfed, sometimes violated. The shame fell on them, not the master, not the household, and if a girl became pregnant out of wedlock, the punishment was swift and unforgiving. She might be cast out, named publicly, denied communion. Her child would be branded illegitimate, its future already damaged by her supposed failing. Still, many endured. They adjusted. They learned how to listen closely, speak carefully, move quietly. They learned where to step and when to hide, how to hold their dignity when they were shown none. Some of these girls eventually became wives. Some stayed in service all their lives. Some disappeared from the record. But in all cases their worth was weighed not in choices but in compliance. And yet, even in this structure, moments of brightness remained. A girl laughing with her sister while hauling firewood. A mother teaching her daughter how to braid hair and say prayers. A grandmother whispering old songs beside the hearth. A young maid who found, for a time, kindness in a cook, who taught her how to slice bread without waste. These weren't victories, but they were survivals. Girls in the Middle Ages were rarely asked what they wanted, but that doesn't mean they had no dreams. Some carved little dolls out of wood and carried them in aprons. Some watched the priest's books and wondered about letters. Some lingered too long at the window, looking out at roads they would never walk. Some imagined a life where they could speak louder. The world didn't encourage such dreaming, but it didn't forbid it entirely either, and a few did find their way to unexpected strength, not through rebellion, but through resilience. The kind that doesn't shout, the kind that persists day after day even when no one is watching. Girls were taught to keep their heads bowed, but they still saw everything. They learned the patterns, the rules, the power of silence. They became the memory keepers of their families, the quiet forces behind every harvest, every meal, every sickbed. History recorded kings and knights, but it was girls, young, hidden, unthanked, who wove the cloth, planted the flax, sang to the infants, and patched the linen that held entire villages together. To be a girl in medieval Europe was not easy. It was not gentle, but it was a role filled with skill, with rhythm, with the deep repeating heartbeat of women who made do with little, and kept going anyway. To grow up in medieval England was to live inside a system you didn't choose, a system older than memory, one that tied your footsteps to the soil of a manor, the rules of a guild hall, or the silence of a church bell. Childhood here was shaped by rhythm. Not the playful rhythm of games, but the labouring rhythm of the land, the calendar of saints, the tolling of obligations. In the countryside, the manor defined everything. It wasn't just a house, it was a world. Most English children were born into peasant families tied to these manorial estates. Their homes were huts, wattle and daub walls, thatched roofs, dirt floors. A fire burned in the centre. The smoke found its way out, or it didn't. Chickens came and went as they pleased. Pigs sniffed through the straw. Everything was close. Everything smelled of ash and earth. From the beginning, children were expected to contribute. A toddler might shoe hens from the grain sack. A 5-year-old could carry water or firewood. By 7, the work began in earnest, in fields, in pastures, on roads, not as play, as necessity. You might be sent out to guard the crops with a rattle, chasing away birds from the newly sown barley. You might gather nettles, berries, sticks. You might dig alongside your father or sweep for your mother. There was no line between child and worker, only a question of size, strength and survival. Danger lived everywhere. In one coroner's record from London, a child drowned while trying to swing from the side of a bridge. In another, a baby in a cradle burned alive when a coal rolled from the hearth, knocked by a pig rooting too close. These weren't freak events. They were part of the terrain of English childhood. Inside the village, the church had a voice. The parish priest taught catechism to local children, usually once a week. They learned the Lord's Prayer, the Ave Maria, and little more. Some memorised the 7 deadly sins. That was the curriculum. There were no classrooms, no desks, just cold stone and the sharp bark of the moral instruction. Few peasant children could read, fewer could write, but they learned other things: how to braid ropes, spin thread, pluck geese, gut fish, haul baskets, and kneel without complaint. They learned how to avoid the bailiff's wrath, how to trade gossip without speaking too loud, how to survive winter with half a sack of oats and a prayer. And then there were the towns, in places like York, Lincoln, Norwich and London. Children's lives followed different routes, still constrained, but with new kinds of walls. The world of the Guildhall awaited. If a boy's father was a tradesman, a cooper, a tanner, a goldsmith, that boy might be apprenticed. This was a contract, a transaction, often sealed by handshake or coin. The child would be sent to live with a master, not as a guest, as a subordinate. An apprentice slept in the workshop or attic, ate what the master ate, if he was lucky, obeyed every rule. He worked the bellows, stirred the dye, fetched tools, scrubbed floors. He learned by repetition, and discipline was part of the package. Some guilds allowed physical punishment for disobedience. Some masters used more than permission. The goal was not just skill, it was transformation. A good apprentice became a good journeyman. A good journeyman might one day become a master. But many did not reach that far. They aged out, burned out, were injured, or failed to impress. For girls in towns, the paths were narrower. Few became formal apprentices, though some were allowed into certain trades: brewing, weaving, embroidery. Most became servants in wealthier households. They swept floors, spun thread, prepared food, cared for infants. Some were absorbed into guild families, others passed through a dozen doors before finding one that kept them. Town life was less predictable than manor life. There were more people, more movement, more danger, more noise, markets, processions, drunks, plague, fire, and in the cracks of all this, children found ways to slip into mischief or vanish into labour. In both village and town, childhood ended early, not by ceremony, by expectation. By 14, a child was likely married, apprenticed, or in full-time service. If they remained at home, it wasn't because they were protected, it was because they were still needed. You became an adult when people stopped giving you orders and started expecting you to enforce them. There were games, yes. Traces of joy survive in archaeological finds. Wooden dolls, clay animals, carved whistles, toy knights, little pots with tiny fingerprints hardened into the surface. Children played in the mud, in the alleys, between the hedgerows. But these were gaps in the day, not the point of it. Some children entered church service. A select few boys, usually from literate or wealthy families, were trained as choir boys. They memorised hymns, attended Mass daily, sometimes learned to read and sing in Latin. Their lives were structured, disciplined, cold. If they faltered, punishment followed. But the promise, however distant, was one of spiritual elevation. Maybe they'd become priests, scholars. If not, they'd still carry the memory of stone columns and incense into whatever lay beyond. For the children of craftsmen, learning came through hands, for peasants through backs and knees, for nobles through protocol, for the church through silence and song. But everywhere, Across manors and markets, fields and guild halls, children in England were being prepared not for freedom, but for function. Girls were trained to obey, serve, produce. Boys were trained to perform, endure, provide. Emotions were secondary. Survival came first. Yet despite this hardness, there were attachments. Fathers who carved little toys from firewood. Mothers who whispered prayers as they braided hair. Siblings who stole crusts of bread and shared them under stairs. These were not romantic gestures. They were practical, small acts of resistance against a world that rarely gave more than it demanded. The structure of medieval English life pressed in from all sides. The manor demanded labour. The guild demanded discipline. The church demanded obedience. Childhood did not last, but children did. They moved through this world quietly, leaving behind worn sandals, scratched initials, broken toys. They were not often recorded, but they were everywhere, hauling grain, grinding flour, singing, crying, enduring, and they were, in their own hidden way, the reason everything else functioned at all. In medieval France, a child's world could begin in a cold stone chateau or a sun-baked village, but the difference between them was more than stone or soil. It was a difference of destiny. One child might wake to servants and psalms, another to roosters and the ache of morning frost. Their feet touched the same ground, but the path before them was divided from the start. In the countryside, children were born into a rhythm older than memory. The village set the pace. Fields needed ploughing. Chickens needed chasing. Cloth needed dyeing. Most families had little, and every pair of hands, even the smallest, counted. A peasant child in rural France began life close to the earth. Before they could speak, they crawled through straw and dust. By 5, they were learning to carry buckets, to sort herbs, to follow goats out into the hills. By 7, they were trusted with real tasks, not out of sentiment, but survival. You learned because you had to. You remembered because forgetting meant punishment or hunger. They worked alongside parents, sometimes barefoot, sometimes hungry, always expected to endure. They helped collect kindling, grind grain, wash pots, herd animals. They were quiet in church, quiet at table, quiet in grief. They saw their elders bow before landlords and priests, and they learned, without being told, that life was about submission and rhythm, not questions, not change. Boys were pulled toward labour, girls toward hearth. But the weight of expectation fell on all, and yet, even in the grind of subsistence, there were fragments of wonder. A carved toy tucked into a child's sleeve, a local fair that brought bright cloth and foreign spices, a ball made of bundled rags passed from one muddy hand to another. Joy was not common, but it was found. A few children in villages learned to read, usually boys chosen for religious training. A priest might take them in, teach them Latin prayers, show them how to hold a quill, but most learned through repetition and watching. You learned to weave because your mother did. You learned to stack hay because your father did. Childhood was apprenticeship for survival. And then there were the castles. Inside the chateau of France, children breathed a different air. It carried incense, linen, and politics. Noble families viewed children not as dependents but as investments. Heirs, alliances, leverage. Infants were passed to wet nurses within days. A noble mother might visit her child daily, or not at all. Nurses rocked them. Maids bathed them. Chaplains prayed over them. Their names carried weight, and from the moment they could walk, they were taught how to carry it. A noble boy's path was carved in advance. At 7, he might be sent to another noble household as a page. There he would learn courtly behaviour, Latin, horseback riding, swordplay. He was expected to master both etiquette and war, to become both gracious and dangerous. Mistakes weren't punished with scolding, but with shame. A faltering bow could humiliate a house. A broken rule could damage a future. Noble girls were shaped just as intentionally. Their value was measured in modesty, obedience, skill. By adolescence, they were being prepared for marriage, to a man they hadn't met, in a house they wouldn't choose for the sake of property, alliance, or peace. Their days were filled with embroidery, piety, and lessons in conduct. Some were taught to read. Others learned songs, dances, and herbal remedies. A few, very few, received broader education, especially in convents. But their minds were not their own. They were trained to be desirable, manageable, respectable. Christine de Pizan, one of France's rare female scholars, ensured her daughter was educated in a convent. But this was an exception. Most noble girls were trained not for thought, but for presence, for how to walk, how to speak, how to yield without appearing weak. In both chateaux and villages, love existed, but it was often structured by utility. A parent loved their child, but that love was shown through preparation, not pampering. A mother sang lullabies while spinning wool. A father carved a toy from spare wood while sharpening a blade. Affection had to live beside hardship. The church added its own weight. French children, like others across Christendom, were baptized quickly, often within days. Original sin loomed large. A child who died unbaptized was a tragedy not just of loss, but of salvation. Priests taught that even children needed discipline. Confession could begin by 7. Communion soon after. Monasteries and convents offered alternative lives, though rarely by choice. A younger son with no land might be given to the church. A daughter with no dowry might be sent to the nuns. These placements were seen as honourable, sometimes even advantageous, but they required sacrifice, of freedom, of family, of self. For the few children chosen to be educated in cathedral schools, usually boys from well-connected families, life meant chanting psalms before sunrise, copying texts, and learning to fear both God and the master's rod. These students became clerks, priests, scribes. Their path was narrow, but clearer than most. In towns like Paris or Rouen, the merchant class added another layer. Children here saw more goods, more strangers, more noise. They fetched, counted, followed, sold. A baker's son might rise early to knead dough. A weaver's daughter might spin until her fingers bled. Guilds offered structure, but only for those whose families could afford to apprentice them. These children learned quickly that everything, position, food, safety, could be lost with a single misstep. Their work was observed, graded not in letters but in scowls, praise, or coin. They lived close to trade, to dust, to the dreams of their fathers and the debts that haunted their mothers. And still, across France, in hall and hut alike, children found ways to shape their own space. They whispered jokes while folding linens. They watched falcons from the high walls of castles and imagined flying. They slipped from chores to skip stones or chase geese or press flowers into wooden slats. History remembers kings, wars, treaties, but it's in the lives of these children, the ones stirring stew, hauling buckets, kneeling in chapel, that the real rhythm of medieval France can be heard. They did not choose their class, their family, or their path, but they moved forward anyway, with calloused hands, sharpened eyes, and the quiet determination to last another day. In the patchwork of territories that made up the Holy Roman Empire, childhood was shaped not just by class or family, but by the intricate weave of community, what the Germans called Gemeinwesen. It wasn't a word for a place, it was a word for a way of life. A village wasn't just homes and roads, it was responsibility. A town wasn't just buildings, it was a network of names, roles, debts and duties, and into this web children were born, not as burdens or afterthoughts, but as future threads meant to hold it all together. In rural regions, especially among farming families, a child's life began in labour. The needs of the land made no space for long infancy. A baby might be strapped to a mother's back while she harvested rye. A toddler might be given a goose-feather rattle while siblings churned butter nearby. As soon as a child could walk, they were taught to carry water, wood, eggs, whatever would fit in their hands. By the age of 7, a child was no longer a shadow. They were part of the daily economy. A boy might follow his father behind the plough or guard the sheep. A girl might tend to younger siblings while learning to patch linens, grind grain, or feed the chickens. The work wasn't seasonal, it was constant. There was no debate about childhood as a sacred phase. It was brief, functional, and rooted in duty. And yet German rural society offered something that made this duty bearable: collective care. Villages were interdependent. Children were watched not just by parents, but by neighbours. If a widow lost her son, another family might take in the younger children without ceremony. If a child was injured or orphaned, the village responded, not always warmly, but practically. Survival required cooperation. Religious life was woven tightly into this fabric. Children learned to pray before they could write. Boys were expected to recite the Pater Noster by heart. Girls followed their mothers to church, mimicking their gestures in silence. The parish priest taught them the names of sins and the rhythms of confession. Some would go no further than this, but others, especially boys marked by sharp memory or family ambition, were steered toward more formal training. In German towns, childhood entered a different system, one defined by guilds. Urban life in the German lands revolved around trade: cobblers, bakers, smiths, dyers. Each profession had its own guild, and each guild had its own rules. A boy hoping to join had to start early. Between the ages of 12 and 15, many boys were bound as apprentices to a master. The apprenticeship was both opportunity and ordeal. The contract meant the boy would live in the master's household. He would eat at his table, sleep in his attic, work in his shop. Discipline was harsh, expectations high. Guild ordinances permitted beatings for disobedience, and many masters used the rod liberally. But the reward was possible advancement. If the boy endured, learned, and obeyed, he might rise, first to journeyman, then, if lucky, to master. For the son of a craftsman, this was the clearest path to stability, respect, and civic standing. Girls, on the other hand, were rarely admitted into guild structures. Their work was either domestic, as servants, or familial, supporting their father's or husband's trades. In wealthier households, a girl might be taught to embroider, read basic religious texts, and manage a household. But in most towns she learned by doing, hauling water, stirring pots, sewing torn shirts, nursing siblings, surviving. Some towns allowed women into certain trades, weaving, brewing, textiles. But even there, female apprenticeships were informal, unstable, and often terminated when the girl married or became pregnant. The structure of Gemeinwesen extended into civic and spiritual life. Children were involved in feast days, religious processions, and seasonal rituals. On St. Nicholas's Day, boys might receive a small gift or sweetbread, a rare moment of indulgence. In winter, they sang songs outside doorways in exchange for coins or treats. These were the thin edges of tradition that let joy slip in between long stretches of work. Education varied widely. In cathedral towns like Cologne or Mainz, some boys entered Latin schools attached to churches. There, they memorized psalms, copied texts, learned to chant. Punishment for errors was severe, but the path offered a route into the church or city bureaucracy, one of the few upward channels available to non-nobles. Girls, even in these cities, were rarely taught to read unless destined for a convent. Their instruction, if any, came through family. How to pray, how to sew, how to endure, and endure they did. Communal order in the German lands prized obedience, tidiness, and respect for hierarchy. A child's body, like their mind, was trained early. The rod was used in school, in church, at home. Not as cruelty, at least not intentionally, but as alignment. A crooked child would make a crooked adult. Better to bend than break. Yet within this system, children still found ways to express life. They carved patterns into wood scraps. They snuck out after curfew to chase dogs or trade stories behind barns. They mimicked the adults they saw, walking with mock pride, bowing like guildmasters, pretending to scold one another with phrases they barely understood. Even within the narrow lanes of German cities or the wide fields of the countryside, play existed. Not as a right, but as a force that emerged anyway. Order did not cancel imagination. It simply trained it to whisper. Some German children, particularly the sons of merchants or prosperous artisans, found relative security. They were groomed to inherit shops, businesses, city council seats. These children learned early how to count coin, track goods, write contracts. Others, the sons and daughters of labourers, carters, journeymen, knew from their first steps that their lives would be harder. They learned how to barter, to lift loads, to read a master's mood before it turned violent. They learned the corners of streets they weren't welcome in, the shadows where it was safer to hide than speak. Even nobility in the German lands followed these patterns in miniature. A boy born to a knight or minor lord still learned martial training, swordplay, horsemanship, obedience to liege lords, but he also learned manners, the language of court, the rituals of honour. A noble girl learned to manage estates, heal with herbs, offer hospitality. She might read, she might be sent to a convent, but her future too was mapped before she had a say. In the Holy Roman Empire, childhood was not shielded from the pressures of adult life. It was designed to prepare for it, rapidly, rigorously, and without illusion. Children were folded into the communal order because the system depended on them. They didn't just inherit culture, they performed it, reinforced it, carried it forward. And somehow, in the middle of this structure, this grind of guild and grain, they still managed to be children. Quietly, briefly, honestly. In medieval and early Renaissance Italy, a child's world was not carved from the silence of forests or the feudal hush of castles. It echoed with footsteps on stone, the rhythm of bells, the shouts of markets, the rush of trade. Childhood here began not in the shadow of fields, but in the geometry of cities. Florence, Venice, Bologna, Siena. Names that would come to shape the modern world were already forming the earliest blueprints of urban childhood. A boy born here did not grow up learning to tame animals or plough soil. He learned how to watch, to calculate, to walk with awareness through a world built of ambition and walls. Italian city-states were dense, noisy, literate. The household was both private and public. Courtyards echoed with conversation. Streets pressed close. Privacy was scarce, but observation was constant. And children, as soon as they could walk, were watched, not only by family, but by neighbours, clergy, patrons and tutors. In wealthier homes, the birth of a child, especially a boy, was a public event. Midwives were summoned, baptisms were performed quickly, godparents were carefully selected for their social reach. This wasn't only spiritual security, it was political positioning. Every name had meaning. Every connection had consequence. A girl's birth was noted more quietly, still celebrated, still welcomed, but without fanfare. Her future would be crafted more carefully, more cautiously. Dowries were calculated, matches considered before she could speak. But for both boys and girls, early years followed a shared rhythm. Wet nurses fed infants in elite homes. Parents, especially fathers, might remain emotionally distant, expecting obedience before affection. Yet mothers often played an intimate role, managing households, instructing daughters, shielding sons from temperamental tutors. By age 7, children began to diverge. Boys entered formal study, especially in urban centres like Florence and Padua. Schools were not always attached to churches. Some were private, some run by humanist scholars. The focus was shifting, away from rote memorization of scripture toward the seeds of something new. Grammar, logic, rhetoric, the Latin of Cicero, the ethics of Aristotle, the poetry of Virgil. These weren't just lessons, they were incantations of identity. To speak well was to matter, to argue well was to rise. Education here was not soft. Corporal punishment remained common. A boy who failed to recite a line might be beaten. But the content of education had begun to expand. Children were still expected to conform, but now they were also expected to think. This was the early whisper of the Renaissance, and children, especially boys of the merchant class, were its first pupils. Girls, too, could be educated, but with limits. In rare cases, noble or merchant families paid for their daughters to learn reading, writing, and music. Some learned Latin, a few wrote letters, but most were trained in the skills of household command, managing servants, sewing fine cloth, organising kitchens. Their minds were not ignored, but they were rarely stretched. Still, some exceptions broke through. Daughters of educated fathers, those who saw the mind as a vessel worthy of filling, sometimes received instruction equal to their brothers. A few women later emerged as poets, painters, patrons. But their journeys began quietly, in courtyards with chalk and parchment and whispered dictation. Beyond education, City children learned the codes of conduct early. How to walk behind elders, how to bow, how to stay silent in church, how to avoid offending the wrong person. Italian cities were dense with hierarchy, and children learned their place with the same seriousness they learned their prayers. But there was more to life than study and silence. Play existed, loud, elaborate, sometimes dangerous. Children raced through alleys with hoops and sticks. They played ball games that sometimes tipped into brawls. They mimicked adults, staging mock councils, mock trials, mock funerals. The city was a theatre, and every child became both spectator and performer. Public festivals offered temporary freedom. Carnivals, saints' days, civic parades. Children joined in masks, laughter, mischief. Even the rigid structures of the city allowed brief moments of chaos, and children embraced them completely. Family expectations never disappeared. A merchant's son might join his father's shop by 12, not to play with abacuses, but to learn ledgers. He watched coin counted, grain measured, deals made with subtle nods. Trust was built in silence, in presence, in mimicry. Daughters, meanwhile, were often groomed for marriage by 15 or 16. Dowries shaped their futures. A poor match could doom an entire family's hopes. A strong match could elevate generations. Girls became economic pivots long before they understood what the weight meant. For the children of artisans, blacksmiths, masons, tanners, life followed another script. Apprenticeship came early. A boy might be sent to live with a master. He'd wake before the sun, sweep floors, tend fires, carry tools. He learned not from books but from repetition, from mistakes, from pain. Respect was earned slowly. After years of work, an apprentice might become a journeyman. With luck and patronage, he might one day open a shop of his own. But most remained under others' roofs. Most obeyed more than they commanded. Girls in artisan families worked too. They spun thread, helped in kitchens, learned to balance accounts if their mothers were trusted. They rarely apprenticed, but they often became essential to the family's business behind the scenes. In poorer neighbourhoods, especially in Naples or the back streets of Rome, childhood collapsed into survival. There were no tutors, no parchment, no guild protections. Children begged, swept, hauled water. They slept on worn pallets, fought over crusts, and learned to speak quickly and duck faster. But even there, under the weight of labour, they formed bonds, shared crusts, shared stories, shared laughter behind crates or beneath laundry lines. They were not cherished by the state, but they were cherished by one another. In Italian cities, children were not simply small adults, but neither were they sheltered. They were prepared, sharpened, observed. Their childhood was filled with duty, but also with the first breath of curiosity, a thing just beginning to be valued. The early Renaissance didn't remake childhood, but it reframed the questions. It asked whether a child might not only serve, but learn, create, become, whether the mind mattered as much as the name, whether imagination might be worth more than obedience. These questions wouldn't be answered for generations, but they began, quietly, in the stone streets and open courtyards of Italy, carried not just by painters and poets, but by children with chalked fingers and watchful eyes. In the far north of medieval Europe, childhood was shaped by the rhythm of wind, stone, sea and season. It was a land where snow swallowed the sun for weeks, where the soil gave grudgingly, and where a child's first lessons were in silence, endurance, and watchfulness. In Scandinavia, in what is now Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, children grew up not under the dome of cathedrals, but under wide skies and low-roofed halls. Their world smelled of smoke and salt, wool and pine, blood and snow, and from the beginning they were expected to fit into it. A newborn in Norse society was not greeted with indulgence, it was greeted with decision. The act of acknowledging a child was deliberate. If a child was frail, malformed, or born in desperate times, it might be exposed, left to die. This was not done lightly, but it was permitted. The decision lay with the father, but once accepted, the child became part of the family, part of the clan, and part of a chain that stretched backward into saga and story. Even before Christianity spread through the region, there were rituals of welcome. One early custom involved the father sprinkling water on the child, a practice older than baptism. rooted in pagan rites. It was an act of naming, of claiming, of protection. Over time, this ritual was absorbed into Christian baptism, but the core idea remained. The child did not simply arrive, it was received. Infants were swaddled, but not for long. By their second or third year, children were already walking with purpose, helping, carrying, listening. The Norse home, long, dark, heated by central fires, was not a place to hide. It was a place to observe. Everything from bread making to blade sharpening happened in front of them. By age 5 or 6, a child could identify tools, understand basic chores, and speak the names of ancestors who mattered. History was not taught from books. It was told, around hearths, in the pauses between chores, sung during rowing, whispered during mending. Every story carried weight. Every memory was instruction. There was no fantasy of endless childhood. Norse society was too lean, too immediate, too exposed. Work was not optional. Children fetched water, tended animals, sorted herbs, gathered eggs, learned to shear and stitch. A girl might help tan hides. A boy might carry firewood or follow his father to the docks. They were not told, "You'll do this when you're older." They were told, "Watch now," and then do it. What boys and girls learned depended on lineage and gender, but also on need. In some coastal communities, both helped mend nets and salt fish. In inland settlements, they planted turnips, stored grain, kept watch over the hearth. The cold did not excuse them. Neither did illness, unless it was crippling. Religion came late to parts of Scandinavia, and even when it arrived, it settled unevenly. Christian priests baptized children and taught Latin prayers, but the old beliefs lingered. Children heard both the psalms and the sagas. They were taught to fear sin, but also to honour Thor, to respect runes, to avoid trolls. The blend of belief was fluid. In one village, a child might be baptized in a church and still be protected with charms hung above the cradle, iron knives, bundles of rowan, a whispered rune carved into the doorframe. Magic was not dead. It had simply learned to bow in the presence of Christ. Education, in the formal sense, was rare. In cathedral towns like Lund or Trondheim, a few boys, mostly sons of priests or wealthy farmers, might learn to read, but for most, learning was tactile, embodied. You learned how to row a boat by rowing. You learned how to trade by watching the deal. You learned how to skin a deer not in theory, but with blood on your hands. Girls were taught to manage, not just kitchens and cradles, but households, fields, accounts. A Norse woman, even a young one, was expected to hold the keys when her father or husband was away. Girls knew how to count, to bargain, to decide what food to save and what to trade. Marriage came early, especially for girls. By the mid-teens, many were betrothed. Some were sent to neighbouring farms, some married into merchant households. Their worth was measured in domestic skill, fertility, and family name. But strength of will mattered too. In Norse law, women could own property, could initiate divorce. These rights did not erase pressure, but they gave girls, and the women they became, tools to push back. For boys, adolescence brought weapons. A boy of 14 might be handed a spear, might be trained to hunt, to fight, to defend. In war-torn decades, some were drawn into raids, others joined coastal militias. And while the romantic image of Viking boy heroes is exaggerated, the truth remains. Teenage boys were treated as men, expected to act accordingly. Boys were also taught reputation, honour, a concept larger than life, and more fragile than glass. A child who brought shame upon their house, through cowardice, theft, disobedience, carried that stain. Redemption was possible, but hard won. Punishment could be social, not just physical. Isolation, humiliation, silence from the hearth. Yet, even with these weights, childhood held flashes of joy. In summer, children played near rivers, built toy boats, mocked the elders behind their backs. In winter, they skated on frozen lakes with bones strapped to their feet. They carved animals from wood scraps, made dolls from cloth and straw, learned songs from older cousins, verses that didn't always make sense but made them laugh anyway. Festivals gave them more. Solstice celebrations, harvest feasts. days where roles loosened, food was shared, rules bent. A child might see their father drunk, their mother dance, their neighbours forget debts for a night. These moments stayed long after the fires dimmed. Oral culture preserved their voices in unusual ways. Some sagas mention the words of children, warnings ignored, truth spoken plainly. Even if the storyteller erased the child's name, the echo remained. A sense that in these cold lands, even the smallest voice could speak with clarity. Discipline was real. A child who lied might be slapped. One who stole might be beaten. But cruelty for its own sake was frowned upon. Communities valued children, not as luxuries, but as future labour, future legacy. To waste a child through violence was to damage the clan. And if a parent died, the community took notice. If a house burned, others helped rebuild. If a child was orphaned, kin stepped in. The bond of blood was law. The expectation of care was cultural. Children were raised with strictness, yes, but also with a strange kind of respect. They were watched, named, shaped, but not erased, not reduced to shadows. They were part of the rhythm, of boats launched at dawn, of goats herded at dusk, of prayers muttered before sleep, of songs sung while mending sails. They were present. And in their quiet presence they absorbed everything. In the Byzantine Empire, childhood was both protected and pressured, a life suspended between ancient wisdom and imperial expectation. This was not the rustic hardship of the medieval countryside, nor the chivalric grooming of Western castles. This was something else. A childhood lived in the shadow of law codes, golden icons, and the idea that a child's soul and service could both belong to the empire. In Constantinople, and in cities like Thessaloniki, Ephesus or Trebizond, a child's life began within layers of class, of language, of ritual. Infants were swaddled in the folds of Christian orthodoxy, baptized early, given names that echoed saints and emperors. If the family was literate or pious, the newborn was blessed with signs of protection, crosses traced in oil, prayers whispered over the cradle, relics hung from doorways. But even before language, the weight of tradition settled in. This was a society obsessed with order, with purity, with hierarchy, a place where the law defined not only adults but children. Childhood was officially recognised as a distinct legal status, not just because of vulnerability, but because the soul itself was seen as still forming, still mouldable. Boys were groomed to serve, the family, the church, the court. Girls were groomed to preserve, the household, the faith, the name. And the moment a child showed aptitude, in memory, in humility, in decorum, that aptitude was assigned a purpose. Among the elite, education began early. Boys from wealthy or scholarly families learned Greek grammar, rhetoric, arithmetic, and religious texts. Literacy wasn't just a skill, it was identity. To read well was to rise, to recite the Psalms flawlessly, to quote the Gospels from memory. These were signs of refinement, of holiness, of value. The church and state were entwined. A boy might begin as a student and end as a clerk, a monk, a judge, or even a bishop. A few reached imperial service, where knowledge of law and scripture could earn both gold and power. Education was not always gentle. Corporal punishment existed. Teachers struck boys who failed to learn. But Byzantine pedagogy also included encouragement, structure, repetition. They believed in the rhythm of progress, the idea that learning must be hard but not cruel. Girls were more often educated at home. In aristocratic families, a daughter might learn to read liturgical texts or manage correspondence. She might be taught hymnography, basic mathematics, herbal remedies. But the core of her training was moral, chastity, dignity, household governance. She would not argue in courts, but she might control a household with quiet authority. For poorer children, education was sparse but not impossible. In villages, a parish priest might teach letters to a few boys, a scribe might take on a talented apprentice, a widow might pass down oral stories and prayers. The state recognised children as citizens in formation, and so, even outside the palace, the mechanisms of guidance were active. Yet for all this structure, Byzantine childhood could also be fragile. War, disease, famine, none spared the young. And when a child lost one or both parents, the empire responded not only through charity, but through institution. Imperial orphanages were real and remarkable. Justinian, and emperors after him, established state-funded institutions to care for orphans, especially those of soldiers or bureaucrats who died in service. These were not mere almshouses. They had hierarchy, supervision, rules. Boys in these institutions might be taught to read, to chant, to craft. Girls were trained in domestic skills and piety. The goal was not just survival, but integration, to take abandoned children and fold them back into Byzantine society, useful, grateful, devout. The church ran its own systems too. Monasteries took in foundlings. Nuns nursed infants dropped at the gates. Bishops wrote about their duties to protect the weak. The child was seen as both a soul in peril and a resource to be recovered, and yet not all orphans were saved. Children abandoned without witnesses often vanished. Some were taken in as servants. Others were used, abused, traded. There were no perfect protections. The empire could not see into every alley, every farm, every failed harvest. Some children lived entire lives without ever being recorded, useful but invisible. Still, Byzantine law offered more than most medieval systems. It outlined minimum ages for marriage, for contracts, for criminal responsibility. It did not assume childhood was a blur. It named it, protected parts of it, punished violations against it. And beyond law, there was love. Byzantine parents, despite discipline and duty, loved their children deeply. Letters from fathers to sons speak of concern, of prayer, of pride. Mothers embroidered robes for their children, passed down rings, prepared them for marriage with both sorrow and hope. Families clung tightly to each other, especially in times of siege, of illness, of imperial collapse. Children witnessed both opulence and instability. They watched processions of gilded icons and the smoke of burning districts. They learned hymns in the morning and heard rumours of rebellion by night. A boy might see his uncle exiled for political failure. A girl might be married to an older man as part of a dynastic pact. Childhood was not always gentle, but it was aware. Byzantine children were not naive. They were trained to understand the weight of appearance, of decorum, of alliance. Some grew into scholars, some into monks, some into traders or guards or minor bureaucrats, some into mothers too young to carry what they were given. But all were marked by language, by faith, by structure. The Orthodox Church was not a background presence, it was a daily compass. Children were raised in the rhythm of fasts and feasts, icons and incense, confession and procession. The liturgy wasn't distant, it was spoken around them, above them, for them. Even play took shape within this framework. Children staged mock rituals, sang church songs in alleyways, invented saints with fantastical powers. Their imaginations were rooted in what they heard, saw, and feared. They played with clay animals, rag dolls, carved boats. Wealthier children had miniature chariots, balls, even dice. Though gambling was discouraged, games taught skill, timing, and often obedience. Winning mattered, but following the rules mattered more. In times of stability, children thrived. In times of war, they vanished, conscripted, killed, or displaced. The fall of a single province might leave hundreds without homes. The empire saw itself as eternal, but children knew better. Nothing lasted. Not walls, not food, not parents. And still, they persisted. A child in the Byzantine Empire learned early how to balance between reverence and realism, between joy and judgment. They were taught that their soul was eternal, but their safety was not. That God was watching, but so was the state. That love came with rules. That protection came with obedience. They grew into adults who remembered, but rarely spoke, of how tightly the world had gripped them. In the medieval world, childbirth was not a private affair. It was a sacred threshold, a spiritual trial, a gamble with death whispered through prayer and superstition. It did not unfold in silence. It unfolded in breathless urgency, in candlelight, in the tight circle of women who had seen it before and feared it every time. A woman in labour became something between earth and heaven. She was both sinner and sanctified. Pain was not just biology, it was theology. Eve's curse lived in every contraction, and no one forgot it. When a medieval woman felt the first pangs, the midwife was summoned, not with shouts, with runners, with gestures, with the practised discretion of those who knew how quickly joy could become mourning. Midwives were not always licensed, but they were trusted. They brought herbs, towels, hot water, amulets, and prayer. Some knew Latin, most did not. But they knew the weight of blood, the timing of breath, the difference between labour that would end in laughter and labour that would end in silence. The birthing room was not filled with men. Fathers waited outside. Priests were called only when death was near. Women helped women. Sisters, neighbours, older daughters, forming a ring of hands and witness. As the child crowned, charms were spoken. Crosses were drawn in the air. If the labour went long, psalms were chanted. Holy relics were held against the mother's belly. Saints were invoked. St. Margaret for delivery, St. Anne for strength, St. Bridget for mercy. And when the child was born, whole and breathing, the first sound was not celebration. It was urgency. The child must be baptized. The fear of unbaptized death hovered thickly. If the infant appeared weak, the midwife might perform emergency baptism herself, using consecrated water if she had it, or even spittle in desperate cases. The church debated these practices endlessly, but the women in that room chose salvation over theology. For a healthy child, baptism followed within days. A procession formed. Godparents, chosen for status, morality, and often political reason, carried the child, the priest anointed, blessed, named. In that moment, the infant was no longer just a body. It was a soul with standing, a creature marked by grace. Names mattered. A boy might be named after a saint, a grandfather, a fallen warrior. A girl after a martyred virgin, a grandmother, a queen. The name was not fashion, it was fate. Back at home, the mother lay in confinement, a period that could last days or weeks, depending on region, wealth, and recovery. She was not to leave the house until churching, a purification ritual, was performed. It was meant to cleanse her from the spiritual residue of birth, a practice born of both respect and suspicion. Meanwhile, the child entered a world of layered care. Swaddling was near universal. Infants were wrapped tightly in linen bands to keep their limbs straight, to warm them, to protect them from spiritual and physical harm. A well-swaddled baby was believed to grow straight, upright, both in bone and in virtue. Cradles were made of wood, sometimes padded with wool. Wealthy families carved theirs with saints and symbols. Peasant homes used what they had. The child was rocked to sleep by firelight, to the rhythm of lullabies passed down through generations. Feeding was immediate and necessary, and deeply moralized. Mothers were expected to nurse. Breast milk was not just nourishment. It was identity, inheritance, purity. But if the mother could not or would not, a wet nurse was hired. Wet nurses were chosen with care, examined for health, piety, and demeanour. It was believed that a nurse's temperament shaped the child's soul through her milk. Anger, lust, dishonesty. These sins could be transferred through the body. A serene, obedient, devout woman was preferred, even if her pay was low and her life hidden behind the door of the nursery. In wealthier homes, the nurse raised the child for years. Sometimes the child called her mother before learning who their birth mother was. In poorer homes, a neighbour might serve temporarily. In villages, communal nursing arrangements were common. One woman might feed her child and two others while the mothers worked. Sleep arrangements varied. Cradles were used, but so was co-sleeping. In winter, infants shared beds with parents or siblings, wrapped tightly to preserve warmth. The fire never died, but the cold still reached through walls. Illness was always close. Infancy was the most dangerous season of life. Children died from fever, from infection, from accidents, from breathless nights with no known cause. No one assumed survival. Every day was a borrowed thing. Mothers guarded their infants with rituals and charms. Iron objects were hung above the cradle. crosses marked on the forehead, sprigs of rosemary, garlic, salt, all thought to protect against spirits and sickness. In some places, a baby's first cut toenail was burned, lest witches use it for harm. The church offered sacraments, but folk wisdom filled the spaces in between. A crying baby might be cursed, a smiling one might be seen by the wrong eyes. Protection was a patchwork, part gospel, part grandmother, part whispered rhyme. Touch mattered. Infants were held constantly, carried in slings, rocked through chores, danced to sleep. Even in the hardest homes, children felt the skin of another against theirs, not from luxury, but because distance felt like danger. In noble homes, a nursemaid might carry the infant while the lady embroidered or read. In peasant homes, the baby sat in a basket by the hearth, while beans were sorted and bread was baked. Everywhere a child was heard, not always cooing, sometimes wailing, but heard. Early development was not mapped in stages, but in signs. The first tooth was noted, the first steps celebrated. Some mothers pressed their children's footprints into soft clay, dried them by fire, a charm against disease. The first word might be Latin, French, German, or nonsense, but it carried the thrill of prophecy. Children were not considered fully human from the moment of birth. Theologians debated the moment the soul became real, but mothers, midwives, knew better. They heard the heartbeat before the words, felt the heat before the doctrine. To them the child was always real, from the first cry, or even before. Discipline began early, not violent, not yet, but structured. A child who threw food might have their hand slapped. One who woke others with screams might be scolded. The family was a small society, and order was expected. But laughter remained. Fathers tickled their sons. Older sisters made faces for their brothers. Grandparents told nonsense stories to distract a wailing child. In hard times, it was children who softened the room. The church taught that every child bore sin. But in many homes, it was also believed that children could bring blessings, dreams, omens, renewal. A child born during a storm might be a healer. One born during Easter, a peacemaker. As the child moved from swaddled to crawling to speech, the ritual shifted. The first haircut was often saved. The first shoes blessed. Milestones were communal, shared with neighbours, marked by small feasts or songs. By age 7, the child would be called upon for real tasks. But until then, there was a brief window, fragile, flickering, of protection, of nurture, not perfect, not free from sorrow, but sincere. Because in the medieval world every life was uncertain, and every child was a test of faith, of fortune, of the body's ability to hold joy without letting it slip. In the Middle Ages, a child's mind was not treated as a blank slate to be filled. It was seen as a soul in progress, a creature both fragile and dangerous, full of impulses that needed correction. Education was not a luxury. It was a battleground, and at its centre stood the twin towers of instruction, knowledge and morality. Not all children were taught to read, but all were taught how to behave. For most, learning began at home, a mother's hand guiding a child's spoon, a father's silence after a misstep, a sibling's whisper in the dark about what happens when you lie, or steal, or speak during Mass. These were lessons passed not in classrooms, but in glances, in chores, in stories carved from warnings. The church loomed large in every lesson. Morality was not an abstract set of rules, it was a matter of eternal fate. A child who disobeyed wasn't just naughty, they were rebellious in the eyes of God. Original sin was not a theory, it was a stain carried from birth, and education was the scrub brush that might keep that stain from spreading. From the age of 7, the so-called age of reason, a child was expected to know right from wrong, to understand confession, to fear damnation. Catechism was not optional. It was memorized, drilled into the mind alongside the Lord's Prayer, the 10 Commandments, the names of saints, and the 7 deadly sins. Priests and friars often served as the first teachers, especially in towns and larger villages. Lessons took place on wooden benches or stone floors, with nothing but a wax tablet or a borrowed psalter to write on. Some children scribbled with chalk, others repeated the same prayers for hours until they stuck, not understood, but preserved. And yet, this was not rote without meaning. The very act of learning was considered an act of discipline, a spiritual strengthening. To control the tongue, to master the memory, to bow the head. These were the tools of instruction. In wealthier families, merchant, noble, or clerical, education expanded. Boys were sometimes sent to grammar schools run by the church or private tutors. There they learned Latin, the language of scripture, of law, of power. They copied sentences from Cicero, translated verses from Virgil, passed sermons word by word. Errors were punished, excellence was praised. Girls rarely attended formal schools, but some were taught at home, to read religious texts, to write simple letters, to manage a household ledger. In convents, education could be broader: theology, music, medicine, philosophy, but always framed by obedience, by modesty, by silence. Books were rare, each copy a work of labour, handwritten and expensive. To own a book was to own a treasure. To read one aloud was a social event. Children gathered at night to hear lives of saints, miracle tales or moral parables, fables where animals spoke truths, and poor children rose through virtue. These stories shaped the young more than any rule. The tale of a monk who starved for honesty, the legend of a peasant girl who prayed so deeply she healed a plague-stricken town. These were not fantasies, they were models, mirrors. Discipline in education was harsh. The rod was used without apology. A child who laughed during lesson could be struck. One who mispronounced Latin might be forced to kneel in ashes or stand outside in cold. These were not considered abuses, they were corrections, and corrections were mercy, saving the child's soul from greater sin. Yet learning also brought joy. A boy who grasped a new prayer felt pride. A girl who read her first line without help smiled. These moments, rare, glowing, became lifelines. In monasteries and cathedral schools, gifted children were sometimes selected for special training. These boys might rise to clerical roles, to positions in chancery or diplomacy. Their path was narrow but defined. They studied from dawn to dusk, fasted regularly, memorized psalms by candlelight. Even here, education was not just about knowing, it was about control, self-discipline, moral clarity, fear of corruption. The body was a distraction, the mind a battlefield, and the child's soul was still in danger. Moral instruction came in many forms, through sermons certainly. Priests preached directly to children during feast days or before sacraments, but also through parents, through village elders, through example. A boy who saw his father kneel after yelling learned something. A girl who saw her mother give away the last loaf understood sacrifice better than any psalm. Punishment at home mirrored punishment at school. A wooden spoon, a switch, a scolding that lasted into the next day. But alongside punishment came rewards, a sweet bun for patience, a kind word after church, a seat by the fire when guests arrived. Some families used tales to teach behaviour, stories of wolves who devoured greedy boys, of fairies who stole children who skipped chores, of angels who wept when lies were told. These fictions did the work of ethics. They stayed longer in memory than rules ever could. In many towns, guilds began to offer forms of structured training. Apprentices were taught not only how to cut leather or mould iron, but how to behave. A master might teach a boy to bow, to speak respectfully, to avoid taverns, to honour feast days. The workshop became an extension of the school. Girls in domestic service learned through imitation, watching how a cook kneaded dough while whispering a prayer, watching how a mistress received guests with bowed head and quiet voice, learning when to speak and when not to. Some children resisted, some laughed at the priest, some skipped lessons, some made up their own psalms with dirty words, and they were punished, not just for disobedience, but for threatening the fragile structure that kept sin at bay. But others absorbed every lesson, became pious, became useful, became safe. There were exceptions. Children who asked questions no one could answer. Children who learned too quickly or too slowly. Children who did not fit, who stammered, who cried too much, who daydreamed when they should have copied. Some were corrected into silence, some into submission. Some were misunderstood, misnamed, misplaced, and some, a few, found their way despite it. They became scribes, teachers, wanderers who quoted scripture in the marketplace and gathered children to listen. They didn't forget the pain of being shaped, but they found a voice within the system, rather than against it. Because medieval education was not just a way to train minds, it was a way to forge souls, to place each child into the great chain, of family, of church, of kingdom. You were taught not simply how to read, but how to pray, not just how to write, but how to behave, not just what to know, but who to be. In the medieval world, there was no such thing as a childhood without labour, no waiting room before adulthood, no protected space carved out for play. To be born was to begin a slow, steady climb toward usefulness, a climb that started earlier than you might imagine and rarely paused, even for breath. The concept of work as a burden laid on adults, that was modern. In the Middle Ages, work was life, work was identity, and children were not exceptions. They were expected to help, because they had to. In the countryside, a peasant child's day began before sunrise. If you were old enough to walk, you were old enough to carry something, kindling, eggs, wool, a sibling. Your size determined your task, not your age. The smaller children were sent to shoe birds from the fields with clappers or shout at the goats. The older ones followed their parents into the soil. Weeding, planting, watering, hauling. Work taught rhythm. A child learned the turn of the seasons not from poetry, but from aching limbs. You knew it was spring because your feet were in mud. You knew it was harvest because your hands blistered. Summer was the time of nettles. Winter was the time of splitting wood until your knuckles bled. There were no weekends, only feast days when you might rest. Unless, of course, your mother was behind on spinning, or your father needed help repairing a fence. The tools were shared. The knowledge passed without ceremony. A child didn't learn by asking questions. They learned by doing, or failing, or being scolded so sharply they never forgot again. In towns, children were absorbed by craft and trade. Sons of craftsmen followed their fathers into the forge, the shop, the stall. Daughters worked alongside their mothers, in back rooms filled with yarn, dye, flour, soot. They sorted, measured, stirred, packed. Apprenticeship came early. Some boys were bound as young as 7, most between 10 and 14. Apprenticeship was both education and exploitation. A boy would leave his family, live with his master, and serve, not for pay, but for promise, for the hope that after years of obedience he might become a journeyman, might travel, might one day open a shop of his own. But that was rare. Most served, most obeyed, most folded themselves into systems that used their hands more than their minds. For girls, labour took other forms. Domestic service was common. A girl of 12 might be sent to a wealthier household to clean, to cook, to mend, to carry trays she couldn't lift and smile at guests who didn't see her. Some stayed for years. Some were dismissed after weeks. Some were harmed and told to keep quiet. The tasks were endless. Scrubbing floors, plucking poultry, carding wool, fetching water from wells a mile away. And yet, these girls were told they were lucky. Better to serve in a home than beg in the streets. In noble families, the work was disguised. A boy was trained to be a page, to fetch goblets, to groom horses, to recite prayers at dawn and clean armour at dusk. These were called duties, not labour. But the body knew otherwise. Noble girls were taught embroidery, etiquette, and the arts of household management. Again, not called work. But every gesture was performance. Every lesson preparation for life as the orchestrator of others' labour. Even in monasteries, children worked. Oblates, children given to monastic life, performed chores, sweeping, tending gardens, copying texts, preparing meals. Choir boys sang long hours in cold chapels, voices cracking under pressure. In all of this, rest was not a right. It was a privilege. Work began early and ended late. For most children, the line between day and night was drawn not by clocks, but by exhaustion. You slept when the fire went out. You woke when the rooster cried, sometimes earlier. And yet not all labour was seen as punishment. Some took pride in it. a boy who could carry a sack of grain without stumbling, a girl who baked her first loaf alone. These were moments of arrival, signs that you belonged. Mothers praised quietly, fathers offered tools without comment, sometimes a nod, sometimes just less correction, and that was enough. The church weighed in too. Work was sacred, labour was penance, idleness was sin. Children who complained were rebuked with scripture. By the sweat of thy brow, they were told. And if a child cried from fatigue, it was met with silence or prayer. Accidents happened, tools slipped, fires burned, children drowned in wells, fell from carts, were trampled by cattle. And the grief was deep but never indulgent. Death was part of the calculation. The family needed every body it could spare, but had learned not to hold too tightly. Some children tried to escape, ran from their masters, hid during chores, were caught, punished, marked. Others learned to survive within the system, to hide mistakes, to work just fast enough, to become invisible when anger rose in the room. Guilds offered structure. Some set rules for how apprentices were treated. Some even limited how many hours a child could work. But enforcement was rare. Masters held power. Children were property, potential, patience. And yet community mattered. In villages, neighbours noticed a child beaten too often. In towns, apprentices shared secrets. In kitchens, maids whispered stories. Solidarity didn't change the work, but it made it bearable. The idea of playing existed, but only in the cracks. A moment before dusk, a pause after chores. Children carved toys from scraps, tossed stones, spun tops, chased dogs, but always with one ear tuned to the next command. Work was not just physical, it was moral. It shaped how you stood, how you spoke, how you measured yourself. A lazy child brought shame. A diligent one brought pride. And pride was precious in a world where futures were so narrow. As children aged, the expectations grew. A boy of 15 was no longer a helper. He was a worker, a contributor, a figure of growing cost if he failed. A girl of 14 was a wife in waiting, or a spinster, or a servant for life. There was no ceremony marking the shift, only a change in tone, in expectation, a missing smile, a longer list of tasks, an extra burden. Children who could not work, due to illness, injury or disability, were often sidelined, hidden, fed if there was enough, tolerated if they stayed quiet. Some became beggars, other wards of the church. A few found kindness, most found corners. Still, within this world, there were moments of grace. A father showing his son how to sharpen a blade, a mother laughing when her daughter's loaf finally rose, an older boy sharing his bread with a younger one who stumbled, a mistress who taught her maid how to write her name. Labour shaped them, yes, hardened some, broke others, but in shaping it also revealed the resilience of a child who kept working with cracked hands, the tenderness of one who paused to help another lift a load, the pride in a task finished even when no one applauded. Because in the Middle Ages a child's value wasn't hidden behind innocence, it was proven in work, quietly, daily, unavoidably. In the medieval world, to raise a child was to mould them, and moulding required force. Children were not treated as blank slates or untouchable cherubs. They were seen as beings in need of correction, born with sin, brimming with folly, and discipline was not cruelty. It was care. It was considered an act of love. From the church pulpit to the peasant hearth, the message was clear. A child left undisciplined was a soul placed in danger. Parents did not flinch from this duty. They were taught that failure to correct their child's behaviour would earn not only shame but divine disapproval. A spoiled child was not simply unpleasant. They were a moral liability, a spiritual failure that could curse a household. So the rod was used, not randomly, but regularly. Corporal punishment was considered normal, even necessary. The Book of Proverbs echoed often in the ears of medieval parents. Spare the rod, spoil the child. And the church agreed. Children who lied were beaten, who stole, whipped, who sassed, scowled or sulked, struck or scolded into submission. Sometimes it was the father's hand, sometimes a wooden spoon, a switch plucked from the hedge, a leather strap kept near the hearth. The tools varied, but the belief was fixed. Punishment came not just from fathers, mothers disciplined fiercely too, especially in homes where they bore the weight of children's daily behaviour. A mother who failed to train her daughter in silence or her son in obedience was considered weak, and weakness brought judgment. In noble houses, discipline was cloaked in structure. Pages were expected to bow correctly, speak only when spoken to, never spill wine or break rank. Failure meant lashes or humiliation. A young noble might be denied meals, made to sleep outside the chambers, or kneel for hours in silence. Discipline was not loud. It was cold, public, precise. In monasteries, discipline was spiritualized. Young oblates, children handed over to religious life, were taught to fear disobedience as a gateway to damnation. A mispronounced psalm might earn a strike, talking out of turn, a loss of meal, lateness, a whipping. But all wrapped in prayer, in silence, in the guise of purification. The schoolroom was no gentler. Teachers in cathedral and grammar schools carried canes. A child who failed to recite Latin verbs could be flogged on the spot. Some were struck for fidgeting, others for daydreaming. Pain was the ink used to write obedience into the bones, but not all punishments were physical. Shame was its own weapon. A child might be made to wear a sign, liar or thief, around their neck, might be paraded through the village, might be locked in a cold corner or isolated in church while the congregation looked on. Silence was punishment, withdrawal of affection, a week of chores without speech, a glance that said, "You have failed us." Discipline was a language, and every family spoke it. In wealthier homes, tutors and servants enforced rules with rigid politeness. In peasant homes, the punishment might come quickly, and be followed by a return to work as if nothing had happened. Tears were not always comforted, guilt was not always soothed, because punishment wasn't about emotion, it was about correction. But discipline also had tears. A child's status shaped the severity and form of their punishment. A noble boy might be reprimanded with words, a servant's son whipped for the same offence. A girl in service might be struck for breaking a dish. A noble girl might be scolded or sent to her room to pray. Punishment was not always fair. It reflected power, proximity, mood. And while the church urged moderation, it rarely intervened unless the punishment was extreme or the bruises too public. Even in cases of visible abuse, society hesitated to step in. The rights of parents, especially fathers, over their children were nearly absolute. Only in the most extreme cases, where injury or death resulted, would legal or ecclesiastical authorities act. And yet, not all discipline was harsh. Some families corrected gently, a firm word, a short lecture, a guiding hand rather than a blow. Stories served as warnings, parables, saints' lives, fables where disobedient children were punished not by parents but by fate. A wolf, a ghost, a forgotten well. Songs and prayers carried warnings too. A child might hear a lullaby that included lines about the devil waiting under the bed, about God watching every bite, every word, every twitch of jealousy. Fear was a frequent tool, but it was dressed in moral clothing. The fear of being bad, of losing heaven, of becoming like Cain, like Judas, like the cursed children of old. Children internalized this. Many feared their parents, not always in terror but in trembling respect. They knew the signs of displeasure, the weight of expectation, the chill in the room when they'd failed. Some rebelled, quietly, by dragging their feet, by hiding, by whispering jokes when backs were turned. Some ran, few escaped, others conformed, learned to obey before asking, learned to smile after pain, learned to earn praise with silence, stillness, submission. Punishment taught more than behaviour, it taught roles, that the parent's voice mattered more, that the priest's words could not be questioned, that the teacher's cane held more truth than the student's confusion, and yet love still existed. Some children, after a beating, were held, kissed, told it was for their own good, told, "This hurts me more than it hurts you." Others weren't told anything. They simply noticed that the scowl had softened, that the room had warmed again. That forgiveness was possible. Over time, some questioned these methods. By the later Middle Ages, thinkers like Thomas Aquinas urged moderation, suggesting that discipline must guide, not destroy. That cruelty masked as correction served no one. But culture changes slowly. For most of the Middle Ages, the hand was quicker than reflection. A child learned to anticipate the strike before it landed, learned to lie if needed, learned that truth sometimes cost too much. Still, within this structure, discipline sometimes gave way to something gentler, to instruction, a lesson paired with explanation, a punishment followed by prayer, a mistake followed by a second chance. And in those moments, something different took root. Not just obedience, but understanding. To imagine childhood in the Middle Ages is to walk a narrow path, one edged by hardship, shaped by theology, and bathed in the flickering light of emotional contradiction. For centuries, the common claim has echoed that medieval parents did not love their children, that they were distant, cold, indifferent, that grief was shallow, that bonds were loose. But this belief is too neat, too modern, and too blind to what history actually whispers. The truth is more complicated, more human. Medieval parents were not heartless. They were cautious. In a world where infant death was constant, where war and disease stole the young without warning, love became both a blessing and a burden. To love deeply was to risk deeply. And still, they did. You see it in the way a mother wrapped her child in talismans, in the way a father carved a toy from scrapwood after sundown, in the way lullabies carried prayers, in the way tombstones listed children's names first, not just once, but again and again, across centuries of stone. Affection in the Middle Ages didn't always look like ours. It wasn't captured in portraits or celebrated in poetry, but it was folded into gesture, into preparation, into touch. A peasant mother might wake before dawn to heat water so her child could wash. A noble father might arrange a match that guaranteed his daughter protection, not just wealth. A monk might save bread from his own ration for an orphan too thin to kneel properly. Parents did scold, did strike, did expect discipline over warmth. But love coexisted with correction, sometimes even grew from it. Letters from medieval fathers to sons often begin with prayers for health, hope for wisdom, longing for virtue. Some even include blessings handwritten across the margins, repeated 3 times for protection. These were not the words of men who did not care. Mothers, when they could write, wrote less formally, more feeling, more plea, more worry. One begged her son not to ride to war. Another sent herbs she could not afford, hoping they'd ease her daughter's pain. Even when children died, and they often did, grief was not absent. It was simply shaped by a theology that demanded endurance. Tears were not always public, but they fell. Monks recorded children's deaths in margins of illuminated texts, died in the night, baptized, soul safe. One added simply, "He laughed yesterday." That was all, but it was everything. Children were not invisible. They were not unloved. They were simply born into a world that required strength early, demanded labour fast, and punished softness when it threatened survival. But within these rough frames, moments of tenderness bloomed. A girl brushing her mother's hair by firelight, a boy helping his grandfather lace boots, a sibling tucking cloth around a newborn while no one watched. These weren't recorded, but they happened. Because medieval children were not just future adults, they were present souls. They mattered. And those who raised them, with all their flaws, their fears, their failings, often knew that. The problem is not that love didn't exist, it's that love, like childhood, had no safe place to rest. No pause, no guarantees. The next cough might be the last. The next war might steal a son. So parents learn to love with armour on. And children learn to love back in the same way. That doesn't make the emotion weaker, it makes it braver. Even in convents and monasteries, where children were placed young and without choice, records show bonds between caregivers and wards. A nun writing about "my little Martin, who sings too loudly." A prior noting a boy's absence from the morning psalm with sadness, not irritation. Love was rarely spoken, but it was known. You see it too in the Church's obsession with the child soul, with baptism, communion, confession, with protecting innocence not just from sin but from forgetting. The Church feared what children might become, but that fear only existed because it saw their potential. Communities noticed children, feared for them, hoped for them. On feast days they gave sweets. On bad omens they locked their doors and checked on neighbours. On plague days they hid their children under cloaks as if fabric could stop death. Even justice was reshaped for children. Many regions across medieval Europe had different punishments for minors. Age of reason, often set at 7, became a legal threshold. Before that, a child could not be judged. After that, only cautiously. There was in this world of cruelty and belief a small space carved out for children. It wasn't always enough, but it was there. And now, as we step back, as we look at the life of a medieval child from birth to adolescence, from swaddle to spindle, from prayer to punishment, we must ask the harder question. Not just, were they loved? But, what did it mean to be a child in a world that didn't slow down for them? It meant growing fast, working early, enduring pain, learning without mercy. It meant being shaped not only by parents but by priests, lords, masters. It meant being watched, not always with affection, but often with expectation. Yet even so, it also meant wonder. The wonder of candlelight on parchment, of rain against a chapel roof, of a new pair of shoes from an older sibling, of whispered stories that made monsters less scary. It meant survival, not just of body but of imagination. We often think of medieval childhood as bleak, and it was, but only in part, because alongside hunger there was song, alongside death there was devotion, alongside punishment there was persistence. Medieval children laughed, played, learned, fought, forgave. They left behind not just bones and silence, but echoes, and if you listen closely, to the records, to the margins, to the half-saved scraps of song, you'll find their voices, not always loud, not always whole, but real. They were here, they were noticed, and they mattered. To understand how medieval society saw children, we must begin with what they did not see. They did not see innocence as automatic, they did not see childhood as a sanctuary, and they did not see youth as separate from sin. Childhood was not a garden, it was a crossing, narrow, necessary and full of risk. Yet to say that medieval people did not recognise childhood at all would be false. They saw it, they measured it, they even named its phases, not just as physical growth, but as moral territory. Scholars of the period spoke of childhood in layers, infantia, puritia, adolescentia, each with its own expectations, dangers and developmental mile markers. Childhood then was not invisible, but it was viewed through the lens of theology, labour and utility, not psychology. A child was not presumed to be good. They were presumed to be formable. They were born with sin, shaped by habit, defined by correction. The soul was seen as malleable in early years, not innocent but flexible. That flexibility was both opportunity and danger. What you did with a child mattered, not to protect a stage of wonder, but to direct a future adult toward salvation. This is what separated medieval thought from modern sentiment. The child was not a separate creature. They were an adult in becoming, a potential being, halfway between wildness and worth. Yet paradoxically, it was because of this belief that the young were watched so carefully. Parents observed their children's behaviour for signs of virtue or vice. A selfish toddler was not simply going through a phase. They were revealing their inner bent toward pride, gluttony, wrath. Corrections were swift because time was precious. The soul was growing or spoiling. The Church reinforced this perspective. Original sin meant that children entered the world not with innocence, but with the need for redemption. Baptism was urgent. Instruction was urgent. Obedience was urgent. And yet, even within this strict frame, glimpses of childhood's uniqueness broke through. Writers like Bartholomaeus Anglicus spoke of children's fragility, their joy, their spontaneity. He noted their laughter, their play, their energy. He described how they were slower to speak, quicker to cry, easily influenced, and therefore deserving of special care. Theologians debated when the soul became fully rational. Some said 7, others said 12. But all agreed that the early years held something unstable, something unformed, that in these years, guidance mattered most. What emerges is not a denial of childhood, but a different kind of attention to it. Less sentimental, more strategic, and yet, that doesn't mean they lacked affection. Manuscripts show illustrations of children at play, tugging toys, chasing animals, mimicking knights. Marginalia in religious texts include doodles of toddlers pulling cats' tails or stealing apples. These aren't just jokes, they're records of observation, of memory. Parents noticed their children, noted how they slept, how they smiled, how they asked questions that no adult could answer. They didn't always write poems about it, but they felt it. Medical writers of the time described children's bodies in detail. Soft skulls, rapid pulses, smaller limbs. They prescribed gentler treatments for children than for adults. They knew the young were different, that they needed different care, different food, different rules. Educators knew it too. School books were structured with shorter lessons for beginners. Moral tales were simplified. Psalms were chosen carefully, not just for spiritual impact, but for memorization ease. The pedagogy was not absent, it was just rigid. In convents, nuns wrote of their young charges with tenderness. One called a 10-year-old oblate, "my wild little bird." Another described how a girl wept when forbidden to sing at matins. These are not the words of people blind to emotional development. These are the words of caretakers navigating a world with limited language for what they saw. Even punishment was scaled. A 5-year-old might be scolded, a 10-year-old struck, a teenager punished like an adult. The very gradation reveals recognition. Age mattered. Growth mattered. Childhood had stages, and each stage came with its own risks. Still, the defining feature of medieval perceptions of childhood was this. It was not a destination. It was a passage. No one stayed there. By 7, a child was expected to work, to learn, to confess. By 12, to fast. By 14, to marry. Childhood passed not in wonder, but in increments of usefulness. You became what you could contribute. This didn't mean that joy didn't exist. It just wasn't the goal. The joy came in flashes, between labours, between lessons, between liturgies. A game of chase behind a barn. A crumb of honey on Easter morning. A story told by firelight with the shadows moving just so. These moments mattered, even if they were not memorialised. And perhaps that's what makes childhood in the Middle Ages so difficult for modern minds to grasp. We look for photographs, for diaries, for toys saved in glass boxes. They left none, but they left signs. Signs in law codes that outlined child rights. Signs in prayers crafted for children. Signs in the way communities rallied when children fell sick, went missing, or showed signs of divine favour. A child saint, a child martyr, a child visionary. They knew children mattered, even if they didn't wrap that knowing in the language of nurture, of innocence, of fragile magic. Even if they used the language of discipline, of obedience, of sacred trust. Even if they feared childhood as much as they cherished it. And that fear wasn't always misplaced. Childhood was a dangerous thing, physically, spiritually, socially. To be a child was to be vulnerable, to be dependent, to be shaped by hands you could not choose. But within that fragility, the medieval world saw value, not softness, but promise. And that promise came with pressure, to obey, to mature, to follow the path laid out by saints and statutes. It was not a childhood free of fear, but neither was it empty of wonder. And as we reach the close of this section, as we sit with the idea of what it meant to grow up when play was short and silence was long, we begin to understand something deeper. They didn't lack love. They lacked margin. They didn't deny emotion. They lacked words for it. They didn't miss the child. They just expected them to become something faster than we do. And somehow, despite it all, children still found ways to be children. Discipline in the Middle Ages was not an afterthought. It was a cornerstone, a theological obligation, a social expectation, a form of love that carried the shape of fear, and it carved emotional distance as surely as it promised moral alignment. From the moment a child could walk, they could err. An error was not seen as childish, it was seen as dangerous, a sign of disobedience, a crack in the wall, a possible opening for sin. The response, swift, unflinching. Shaped by a conviction that correction was not cruelty, it was care. Medieval parents did not believe in sparing the rod, not because they were harsh, but because they feared what might happen if they didn't act. The soul, they were taught, grew crooked when left to its own devices. A child's will, if not bent early, would harden, then break. So they struck, they scolded, they shamed. A lie told by a child might bring a slap. A broken object might lead to hours in silence. A disobedient answer could merit humiliation, public or private. And few questioned it. The church backed them. From the pulpit came the echoes of Proverbs, the words of St. Augustine, the commentaries of Thomas Aquinas. Discipline was seen as a divine duty, one that mirrored God's correction of humankind. Whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth, and so too must parents. But behind the scriptural scaffolding lived something quieter, something colder, an emotional architecture that prioritised fear over warmth, that demanded distance over familiarity. Most children feared their fathers, not because they were monstrous, but because reverence was demanded. Too much affection was seen as weakness, too much laughter, indulgence. A child who felt too safe might forget their place, so love was wrapped in rigidity. Mothers, though more present, could be just as severe. In the peasant's home, the noble's hall, or the monastery's dormitory, correction came through clenched lips and narrowed eyes. The message was not, "I am angry," but "you have disappointed us all." And the child learned to shrink, to anticipate the frown, to flinch at the raised voice, to lower their eyes even before they had done wrong. This emotional suppression wasn't accidental. It was practiced, taught, modelled. A disciplined child was a quiet child, an obedient child, a safe child, one less likely to bring shame to the family name, or draw the attention of a priest, or end up condemned by rumour. Even in education the distance held. Teachers struck students for mistakes, mocked them for hesitations. Discipline was part of learning, and emotional detachment was part of that discipline. No teacher was meant to coddle. Their job was to mould, and moulding meant chiselling, not cradling. Children in response developed defences, emotional calluses. They didn't stop feeling. They learned to hide what they felt, to smile when praised but never too widely, to cry, if they had to, in places where no one could see. Over time, they learned to distrust tenderness. A soft tone might precede a harsh correction. A hand reaching out might mean a lecture. And so, even love came under suspicion. Not always, but often. That's the danger of a system that pairs affection with fear. The child never quite knows where they stand, and uncertainty becomes habit. In noble houses the performance was sharper. A boy of high birth learned to present himself with cold grace, to kiss his father's ring without speaking, to accept critique with a bowed head. Even praise came with conditions. You did well today. Don't grow proud. Your handwriting has improved. Don't let it falter. Girls were taught silence as virtue. A quiet girl was a good girl. A still girl, a blessing. Emotions were to be contained, curiosity clipped, defiance punished. In monastic life the discipline deepened. Children given to the church, oblates, were expected to abandon childish ways before they understood them. They learned to pray instead of play, to confess instead of cry. Emotional need was a distraction. The goal was spiritual clarity, not comfort, and yet the need never vanished. It surfaced in unexpected places, in the way a child lingered near a kind voice, in the way they memorised stories where children were safe, in the drawings they scratched into chapel walls, crude, joyful, rebellious, in how they whispered to each other at night, shared crusts, protected secrets. These were small rebellions against emotional distance, attempts to stitch warmth into a cold weave, to remind themselves they were more than obedience machines, because children felt everything just as we do: confusion, fear, shame, hope. They just weren't allowed to say it. The emotional silence of medieval childhood wasn't total, but it was structural. Some families broke the mould, some fathers softened with age, some mothers whispered reassurances behind closed doors, some teachers noticed a student's trembling and held the cane back. But they were the exceptions. The rule was formality, detachment, love expressed through duty, not expression. We see its echoes in the writings of the time. Letters that ask after a child's virtue, but not their feelings. Records that note obedience, but not joy. Histories that describe childhood as a staircase. No landings, only steps. And we wonder, how did that shape the children who lived it? Some became numb, others angry. Others learned to perform perfectly, to be whoever their parent, priest or master needed them to be. But a few carried tenderness like a smuggled flame. They protected it, grew it, passed it on when they could, and that's how we know it survived. Because even in the coldest systems, warmth finds a way. Even in centuries of correction, love remembered how to reach. Through a softened gaze, a shared song, a hand that hovered just long enough before the strike, and then never landed. For the medieval child, religion was not learned. It was lived. There was no slow introduction, no gentle awakening to faith. The world itself was sacred, and sacredness demanded allegiance from the start. By the time a child could walk, they had been anointed, crossed, prayed over, and warned. By the time they could speak, they knew the name of God, and feared it. Faith was not presented as choice. It was the air they breathed, the spine of law, the boundary of morality, the rhythm of the day. The church was everywhere. Its bells divided time. Its priests marked birth, confession, communion, and death. Saints looked down from the walls. Relics sat beneath the altar. The Gospels rang from every pulpit, echoed in every field. And children were expected not only to listen, but to internalize. From the moment of baptism, the child belonged to the church. Baptism itself was urgent, often within hours of birth, not just for ceremony, but for spiritual insurance. An unbaptized infant who died was believed to risk eternal limbo. That fear alone drove generations to keep holy water close, to train midwives in emergency rites, to whisper the name of Christ before a child took their first breath. Then came the training. Instruction began early. Even before formal schooling, children were taught the basics: the sign of the cross, the Pater Noster, the Ave Maria. These weren't just prayers, they were protective spells, moral mantras. A child who forgot them was thought vulnerable to temptation, to demons, to disobedience. By age 7, the so-called age of reason, a child was expected to confess their sins. They were expected to understand right from wrong, to fast during Lent, to kneel properly, to hold silence during Mass. This was not a suggestion. It was a spiritual responsibility, and from that point onward, education was infused with religion. In cathedral schools, grammar was taught through Latin psalms, rhetoric through sermons, memory drills were rooted in catechism, morality was embedded in fables, where disobedient children were turned into beasts or struck down by God. Even writing practice might involve copying sacred texts, not for beauty, but for absorption. It was believed that repetition etched virtue into the soul. Fear played a role too. Children were taught about hell before they understood hunger, about demons before they understood death. The devil was not a symbol. He was a threat. And they were told, in stories, in sculptures, in sudden warnings, that their actions could invite him in. To steal was to open a door. To lie was to draw his gaze. To skip confession was to risk your soul. And this was not cruelty in their parents' eyes. It was protection. Better to frighten a child into righteousness than lose them to eternal fire. The church agreed. Clergy used the pulpit to teach children obedience. Not just to God, but to parents, to masters, to priests. They quoted Ephesians, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right." They taught that to question authority was to question divine order, and so religion became a scaffold, holding the child upright even when they shook. But not all was fear. There was comfort too. A child who confessed was forgiven. A child who prayed before sleep was protected. A child who kissed a relic might find healing. Religion wasn't only discipline, it was refuge. Monks and nuns, especially those tasked with teaching children, understood this balance. They taught hymns with gentle melodies, told stories of saintly children, Agnes, who died pure, Tarsicius, who protected the Eucharist with his life. These stories were meant to inspire, not only to warn. Convents in particular shaped the faith of girls. Novices were immersed in a world where every breath was a form of praise. Silence was a virtue. Reading was a sacred act. Even sewing had meaning. Each stitch a prayer, each thread a line of scripture. But the line between formation and indoctrination was thin. Children learned what to believe, and what not to believe. Heresy was the greatest threat. Doubt, a sin. Questions were dangerous. A child who asked why the bread became flesh might be corrected sharply. A child who laughed at relics might be punished, or feared. The world was black and white, sacred or profane, belief or error, heaven or hell. There was no room for nuance, only obedience, only faith. And yet, within that rigidity, children carved out their own ways of engaging. They made up saints, played pretend confession, invented their own rituals, blending folklore with doctrine. A child might bury a toad for luck, then pray for Mary's forgiveness. Might carry a bone they believed was magical, then ask a priest to bless it. This wasn't rebellion, it was integration. Children took what they were given, the fear, the beauty, the ritual, and made it their own. They found wonder in the incense, comfort in the chanting, hope in the image of a suffering Christ who had once, they were told, been small like them. And still, indoctrination had its cost. For every child who felt safe in faith, another felt swallowed by it. The pressure to be pure, the shame of failure, the silence of doubt. These were not abstract feelings. They lived in the bodies of children who feared they had sinned and could not name how. They fasted and grew dizzy, confessed and felt nothing, prayed and heard silence. Some grew anxious, others numb, others devout beyond their years, old souls in young frames, bearing the weight of eternity like a stone on their back. Religion gave structure, but it rarely gave room. And so, children learned to navigate it like they did every other part of their world, carefully, watchfully, with a mix of reverence and quiet resistance. In the end, faith was not something they chose. It was something they were shaped by. A child in the Middle Ages lived with death as a companion. Not a distant fear, not a whispered myth, but a constant visible presence, in the cradle beside them, in the cough across the room, in the quiet eyes of a sibling who stopped waking up. Death was not unusual, it was expected, and no child, no matter their birth or prayer, was spared its nearness. The records don't flinch. In some towns, 1/3 of children died before age 5. In plague years, entire generations vanished before they could be named. Mothers stopped counting birthdays, fathers dug graves before they carved toys. Disease was merciless. Fevers came without reason, rashes spread without warning. A bad harvest meant hunger, and hunger meant infection. Pneumonia, measles, cholera, words that modern medicine defangs again were killers then. The church said these deaths were divine tests, or punishments, or mysteries. But to the parents holding cold bodies, theology was thin comfort. They wept, but they wept quickly, because the cow still needed milking, the field needed turning. And death, once done, gave no time back. Some tried to fight it, with prayer, with relics, with pilgrimages. Others turned to midwives, to herbalists, to whispered rituals buried in folklore. Salt in the corners, garlic by the bed, iron above the cradle, but no charm guaranteed safety. And children died anyway, the youngest especially. Infants who never cried, toddlers who slipped into sleep and never woke, and older ones, strong one day, silent the next. Even noble children, wrapped in linen and guarded by servants, fell to disease. Even children of the church, oblates, choir boys, novice girls, were not exempt. The abbey's walls did not hold back the plague. When death came, it came fast. A child might be healthy in the morning, buried by nightfall, and the next morning another. So families learned to mourn without collapsing. They mourned while cooking, while sewing, while praying with hands that still trembled. And what about abandonment? It happened. Some children were left in baskets at church steps, others abandoned in forests or alleys, sometimes out of cruelty, but more often desperation. A widow with 5 mouths to feed, a farmer after a second bad harvest, a servant girl who bore a child in secret. The church took many in, monasteries raised foundlings, convents nursed the discarded, but not always, not everywhere. Some died before they were found. Others were taken in by strangers who wanted labour, not love. The stigma of abandonment lingered. A foundling bore the mark. No name, no bloodline, no inheritance. They became servants, soldiers, sometimes saints, but they always remembered, because even if they were saved, they had been left. And the emotional toll, it ran deep. Children who grew up watching siblings vanish learned to hold back joy. Parents who buried 3 of 5 children learned to love with caution. Siblings learned not to ask why, or where, or who next. The church offered heaven, a hope, a reunion, but it also demanded acceptance. Thy will be done. That was the line. Even when a mother screamed into her hands, some resisted, quietly, naming their children after the dead, keeping a scrap of cloth, a lock of hair, burying toys with the bodies. Others hardened, taught their children early not to cry, not to ask, to work, to endure, to survive. Because to be a child in the Middle Ages was to be at risk of illness, of hunger, of abandonment, of war, of punishment, of being forgotten. But even here, childhood refused to disappear. Children still played, even beside plague pits. They still laughed, even in famine, still whispered secrets, still ran barefoot through ruins. They found ways to live, to love, to dream. And so we reach the final chapter. We have travelled through swaddling clothes and spinning wheels, through church aisles and ploughed fields, through laughter and lashes and lullabies. We have followed the medieval child not just through history, but through heart. And what do we see? Not just hardship, not just cruelty, not just labour. We see resilience. We see small hands learning large truths. We see faith carried by children too young to spell it. We see pain met with perseverance, silence that sheltered dreams, bonds that bloomed in shadow. Because childhood was not absent, it was different, not broken, not lesser, just shaped by different rules. Rules of survival, of theology, of structure. But within those rules, children still found room to feel, to grieve, to imagine, to endure. They were not just future adults, they were souls in progress, voices that mattered, and even now, centuries later, echoes that deserved to be heard. They were not forgotten, not by time, not by memory, and now, not by you.